The 15th Legion began its existence in the blood-soaked crucible of the unification wars on Terra, drawn from the gene stock of the techno-barbarians of the Achaemenid Empire. Unlike many of their brother legions, whose origins were firmly rooted in the martial traditions of Old Earth, the warriors who would become the Thousand Sons manifested peculiar traits from their earliest incarnation. Even before receiving their distinctive crimson power armor, these Astartes displayed an uncanny affinity for the immaterium and psychic phenomena that set them apart from their fellow Space Marines. Initial hypno-indoctrination and gene seed implantation protocols for the 15th Legion followed standard procedures established by the Emperor's gene rites. However, as the first Battle Brothers completed their transformation, unusual psychic manifestations began to appear with alarming frequency. Astropathic communiques would inexplicably strengthen in their presence. Cogitator systems would malfunction in distinctive patterns when they entered certain facilities. Some Battle Brothers reported vivid prescient dreams that occasionally proved tactically valuable in upcoming engagements. The Legion's first deployment came during the latter stages of the Unification Wars, where they fought alongside the Thunder Warriors against the techno-barbarian holdouts in the Caucasus Wastes. Their effectiveness in combat was undeniable, but their methods raised eyebrows among Imperial commanders. Squad leaders would inexplicably redirect their forces moments before hidden enemy ambushes were sprung. Ammunition reserves would be conserved with uncanny precision. Enemy commanders would make inexplicable tactical blunders when facing the 15th. These early manifestations of psychic talent were not yet understood as such by Imperial authorities. The Emperor, of course, recognized the signs, but chose not to draw attention to them. Instead, he assigned the 15th Legion to specialized operations, where their unique capabilities could be employed without excessive scrutiny from those who might fear such abilities. The first true crisis for the 15th Legion emerged shortly after Terra's unification, when the first cases of the flesh change appeared. This horrific mutation caused affected Astartes to transform uncontrollably, their bodies warping into grotesque configurations of additional limbs, eyes, mouths, and other, less recognizable anatomical features. Those afflicted would either die in screaming agony or degenerate into mindless, gibbering spawn that had to be destroyed by their brothers. The Legion's apothecaries were baffled by the condition, which seemed to accelerate in those who exhibited the strongest psychic potential. The Emperor ordered the Legion's gene seed stocks sequestered for study and temporarily halted new recruitment. Rumors spread through the other legions that the 15th had been tainted from inception, and some whispered that they should be disbanded entirely. This dark period saw the 15th Legion's numbers dwindle as the flesh change claimed more victims, and their deployment in the early Great Crusade was limited to small detachments serving alongside larger Legion forces. Meanwhile, across the galaxy, the Primarch who would save them was forging his own destiny on a world of psychic refugees. Prospero, a remote world in the Ultima Segmentum, had become a sanctuary for human psychers fleeing persecution on their homeworlds. These refugees established settlements centered around the capital city of Tizca, the City of Light, where they developed a sophisticated culture that embraced psychic abilities rather than fearing them. Their society was built upon the controlled and disciplined use of their gifts, with strict protocols established to prevent the dangers of untrained psychic activity. It was into this society that the infant Primarch's gestation pod crashed after being scattered through the warp by the machinations of the Chaos Gods. The young Primarch was discovered by members of the Order of Blind Monks, guardians of ancient knowledge who sensed the psychic potential radiating from the child. They named him Magnus, and as he grew, his distinctive red skin and single eye marked him as clearly different from those around him. Magnus developed at an accelerated rate, as all Primarchs did, but his psychic abilities outpaced even his physical growth. By adolescence, he had absorbed the complete psychic and philosophical teachings of Prospero and had begun to explore the immaterium through his own innate connection to it. His power was such that he could enter the dreams of others, communicate telepathically across vast distances, and perceive events occurring light years away. The scholarly culture of Prospero shaped Magnus profoundly. Unlike some of his brother Primarchs who were forged primarily by conflict and warfare, Magnus was molded by intellectual pursuit and the quest for knowledge. He became convinced that humanity's psychic awakening represented the next stage in its evolution, and that mastery of the immaterium was crucial to the species' future. This philosophical outlook would later put him at odds with those who feared psychic power, including some of his brother Primarchs. Magnus quickly rose to leadership on Prospero, becoming the chief librarian and de facto ruler of Tizca. Under his guidance, the city flourished as a center of psychic learning and arcane research. The Prosperine traditions of disciplined psychic practice were codified into formal training protocols that Magnus personally oversaw. He established the Corvidi, Pavoni, Raptora, Athenians, and other psychic disciplines that would later form the structure of the Thousand Suns cult system. However, Magnus' explorations of the immaterium were not without cost. As he delved deeper into its mysteries, he encountered entities that claimed to be benevolent spirits of knowledge. These beings actually disguised demons of Tzinch, though Magnus did not yet understand this, offered him insights and power in exchange for his attention. Magnus, confident in his ability to discern truth from falsehood, believed he could safely interact with these entities while maintaining his integrity. This hubris would eventually have catastrophic consequences. The Emperor discovered Magnus during the early years of the Great Crusade. Unlike the discovery of some Primarchs, which involved military campaigns or complex negotiations, the Emperor's reunion with Magnus was remarkably straightforward. Through his own powerful psychic abilities, the Emperor had sensed Magnus' presence in the galaxy and communicated with him telepathically before physically arriving on Prospero. Their first meeting was a meeting of minds as much as bodies. The Emperor recognized in Magnus a psychic potential second only to his own, and Magnus saw in the Emperor the fulfillment of his own aspirations for humanity's psychic evolution. Their conversations spanned topics from the nature of the immaterium to the future of human psychic development, and Magnus readily accepted his place in the Emperor's grand design. The reunion between Magnus and the 15th Legion occurred aboard the Emperor's flagship, the Bucephalus. The remaining battle brothers of the Legion, many of whom had manifested psychic abilities of their own, immediately recognized their Primarch. The psychic resonance between Gene Father and Gene Sons was palpable, with many legionaries falling to their knees in the presence of the being whose genetic template they carried. Magnus was troubled to learn of the flesh change that afflicted his sons. Upon examining affected legionaries, he recognized patterns in the mutation that corresponded to certain configurations of the immaterium he had observed during his studies. With the Emperor's permission, Magnus secluded himself with the Legion's gene seed stocks and the most severely afflicted battle brothers, working feverishly to find a solution. What occurred during this period remains largely unknown to Imperial historians. What is clear is that Magnus emerged from seclusion claiming to have found a cure for the flesh change. The mutation's progression halted in affected legionaries, and new implantations of gene seed proceeded without incident. The 15th Legion was saved from extinction, and recruitment accelerated to rebuild their numbers. What Magnus did not reveal, perhaps not even to the Emperor himself, was the price of this salvation. In his desperation to save his sons, Magnus had entered into a pact with one of the entities he had encountered in the immaterium, an entity that would later be revealed as the chaos god Tzinch. The exact terms of this arrangement remained obscure, but the entity provided Magnus with the knowledge needed to stabilize the Legion's gene seed in exchange for something. This fateful decision, made with noble intentions, planted the seeds of the Legion's eventual downfall. With their gene seed stabilized and their Primarch at their head, the 15th Legion was formally renamed the Thousand Suns, though the exact origin of this name is disputed in Imperial records. Some claim it referred to the approximately 1,000 battle brothers who survived the worst ravages of the flesh change, while others suggest it was a reference to the 1,000 disciplines of psychic mastery that Magnus intended to develop within the Legion. Under Magnus' leadership, the Thousand Suns underwent a dramatic cultural transformation. The Legion had always attracted intellectually inclined recruits, but Magnus accelerated this tendency, emphasizing scholarly pursuits alongside martial training. The Thousand Suns began collecting and preserving knowledge from each world they brought into compliance, establishing libraries and scriptoriums aboard their vessels. Magnus restructured the Legion according to the psychic disciplines he had developed on Prospero. Battle Brothers were organized into fellowships, each specializing in a particular aspect of psychic mastery. The Corvidae cultivated precognitive abilities, the Pavoni focused on biomancy and physical enhancement, the Raptora developed telekinetic powers, the Athenians specialized in telepathy, and the Piri mastered pyrokinesis. Those without strong psychic gifts became members of the Athenian Fellowship, serving as the Legion's backbone of conventional warriors. This reorganization proved highly effective in combat. During compliance actions, the Thousand Sons operated with a precision and coordination that few other legions could match. Corvidae Seers would identify optimal attack vectors, Raptora Adepts would provide kinetic shields to advancing forces, and Piri cultists would incinerate enemy strongpoints with controlled bursts of warp fire. Their approach to warfare was clinical and methodical, minimizing casualties on both sides whenever possible. Magnus the Red's return to Prospero with his newly reunited legion marked the beginning of a golden age for both the Thousand Sons and the City of Light. Tizca, already a haven for psychers before the Primarch's discovery, transformed under his renewed vision into one of the most magnificent cities in the Imperium. Unlike the utilitarian fortress monasteries of other legions, the Thousand Sons created a metropolis that celebrated beauty, knowledge, and psychic potential in equal measure. Tizca rose from the arid Prosperine landscape as a gleaming collection of crystal spires, marble pyramids, and grand boulevards. The city followed a precise geometric layout, with 9 districts arranged in concentric circles around the crowning achievement of Prosperine architecture, the Pyramid of Phodup. This massive structure housed the Great Library, the spiritual and intellectual heart of the Thousand Sons Legion. The pyramid's distinctive crystal capstone could be seen from anywhere in the city, refracting sunlight during the day and glowing with an inner illumination at night, a literal and metaphorical beacon of enlightenment. Each district of Tizca served a specific function in the Legion's pursuit of knowledge. The outermost ring contained training grounds where aspirants learned both martial skills and the fundamentals of psychic discipline. Moving inward, one would find research facilities dedicated to specific branches of study, from xenobiology to archaeotech analysis. Residential districts featured elegant spires, where Legion officers and Prosperine scholars lived alongside one another, fostering a continuous exchange of ideas between Astartes and mortal. The architectural style of Tizca reflected the Thousand Sons' reverence for ancient human civilizations. Colonnaded walkways reminiscent of old Terran Mediterranean cultures lined the main avenues. Pyramidal structures echoed the monuments of ancient Gyptus. Gardens featuring mathematically precise arrangements of native Prosperine flora created spaces for contemplation and discussion. Unlike the grim, fortress-like constructions favored by many Space Marine legions, Tizca embraced openness and light, physical manifestations of the Legion's philosophical outlook. Perhaps most remarkable were the city's psychically reactive elements. Certain structures contained specially cultivated crystals that resonated with psychic energy, changing color or producing harmonious tones in response to the emotional states of those nearby. The grand amphitheater at the city's heart featured acoustics that could be psychically adjusted to perfectly suit any performance. Even the fountains that dotted Tizca's plazas were said to flow in patterns influenced by the collective psychic mood of the populace. The crowning glory of Tizca was undoubtedly the great library housed within the Pyramid of Phodup. This vast repository contained knowledge gathered from hundreds of worlds brought into compliance by the Thousand Sons. Unlike other legions who measured their conquests in territories claimed or enemies slain, the Sons of Magnus counted their victories in tomes preserved and wisdom recovered. The library's collection was staggering in its scope. Ancient texts rescued from dying human colonies during Old Night sat alongside xenotech analyses and astronomical surveys. Detailed accounts of compliance actions provided tactical insights, while cultural studies of newly integrated human societies helped inform imperial governance strategies. Most precious of all were the psychic texts, carefully preserved grimoires detailing meditation techniques, focus exercises, and the theoretical underpinnings of warp manipulation. Access to the library was strictly controlled, with different sections requiring various levels of clearance. The most dangerous knowledge, particularly concerning the deeper mysteries of the warp, was restricted to senior Legion officers who had demonstrated both the psychic strength and moral discipline to handle such information responsibly. This compartmentalization reflected Magnus' understanding that knowledge, while inherently valuable, could be destructive in unprepared minds. Beyond physical texts, the Great Library incorporated innovative preservation technologies. Psychically active crystals could store experiential memories that could be accessed by trained psychers. Hololithic projection systems displayed three-dimensional models of architectural wonders from across the galaxy. Climate-controlled vaults protected the most fragile physical manuscripts from degradation. The library represented not just a collection of information, but a comprehensive approach to knowledge preservation that drew scholars from across the Imperium. The organizational structure of the Thousand Sons Legion reflected their dual nature as both warriors and scholars. Unlike the rigid, purely military hierarchies of legions like the Ultramarines or Imperial Fists, the Thousand Sons operated through overlapping systems of authority based on both martial rank and psychic specialization. The fundamental unit of the Legion was the Fellowship, typically comprising around 100 battle brothers led by a captain. 10 fellowships formed a chapter, commanded by an adept of significant rank within one of the psychic cults. The Legion maintained approximately 10 chapters, though this number fluctuated as the Great Crusade progressed. This structure allowed for flexible deployment, with fellowships often detached for specialized missions requiring their particular expertise. Intersecting with this conventional organization were the psychic cults, each dedicated to a particular discipline of warp manipulation. Every Thousand Son, regardless of rank, belonged to one of these cults based on their psychic aptitude and personal inclination. The major cults included the Corvidae, masters of precognition and strategic foresight, who could glimpse probable futures and guide the Legion's planning accordingly. Their symbol was the Raven, and they often served as strategic advisors to expedition fleets. The Piri, wielders of fire and energy, who could manipulate thermal energy to devastating effect on the battlefield. Their discipline extended from creating protective heat shields to launching devastating firestorms against enemy positions. The Pavoni, biomancers who studied the manipulation of living tissue, both their own and others. Their abilities ranged from accelerated healing to inflicting cellular breakdown in enemies. Many of the Legion's apothecaries came from this cult. The Raptora, telekinetics capable of manipulating physical objects with their minds. Their battlefield role often involved creating kinetic shields to protect their brothers while using their powers to crush enemy fortifications or hurl projectiles. The Athenian cult specialized in telepathy and mind reading, making them invaluable for intelligence gathering and communication. They could extract information from prisoners, coordinate complex maneuvers without Vox communication, and detect deception with uncanny accuracy. Each cult was led by a Magister Templi who reported directly to Magnus himself. These senior officers formed the Rihati, the Primarch's inner circle of advisors who helped shape Legion policy and strategy. Cult affiliation was marked by subtle variations in armor decoration and the design of psychic-focused devices incorporated into their power armor. For the minority of Thousand Sons who displayed limited or no psychic ability, the Athenian cult provided a home. These battle brothers, sometimes called the Unaugmented, formed the backbone of conventional tactical operations and often specialized in technical roles that supported their psychically gifted brothers. Standing apart from both the fellowship structure and the cult system was the elite Sekhmet, Magnus' personal honor guard, and the Legion's finest warriors. Clad in ornate Terminator armor and recruited exclusively from veterans who had mastered both martial combat and psychic discipline, the Sekhmet represented the pinnacle of what a Thousand Son could achieve. Known colloquially as the Scarab Occult, these warriors combined devastating telekinetic assaults with precision bolter fire and close combat prowess. The The Sekhmet were distinguished by their ornate terminator plate, decorated with esoteric symbols that served both decorative and functional purposes, strengthening their psychic focus. Their helmets featured distinctive curved crests reminiscent of ancient Egyptian nobility, and their shoulder pauldrons bore the symbol of the scarab, representing both rebirth and protection in Prosperine iconography. In battle, the Sekhmet operated as independent strike forces, teleporting directly into the heart of enemy formations to cause maximum disruption. Their psychic abilities allowed them to coordinate with uncanny precision, and their Terminator armor rendered them nearly impervious to conventional weaponry. A single squad of Sekhmet could turn the tide of a compliance action through their combination of psychic might and martial skill. The culture of Prospero and its legion was founded on three interlinked principles: the preservation of knowledge, the disciplined development of psychic potential, and the belief that humanity's future lay in psychic evolution. These values permeated every aspect of life in Tizca and shaped the Legion's approach to warfare, diplomacy, and their place within the Imperium. Knowledge preservation became something of an obsession for the Thousand Sons. During compliance actions, they prioritized securing libraries, data vaults, and centers of learning. While other legions might focus on military objectives or governance infrastructure, the Sons of Magnus would deploy special detachments to ensure that cultural and scientific knowledge was not lost in the transition to imperial rule. This practice occasionally caused friction with other imperial forces who viewed it as a distraction from more pressing military concerns. The Legion developed specialized protocols for knowledge recovery operations. Teams comprising both Astartes and mortal scholars would catalog, preserve, and transport valuable information back to Prospero. In cases where physical retrieval was impossible, they employed memory capture techniques, using psychic abilities to record the contents of texts or the expertise of indigenous scholars. The Thousand Sons maintained that this practice served the Emperor's vision of reuniting human knowledge scattered during the Age of Strife. Psychic development on Prospero followed a structured, disciplined approach that stood in stark contrast to the fear and superstition that characterized attitudes toward psychers on many imperial worlds. From childhood, those who displayed psychic potential underwent rigorous training focused on control, ethical use of abilities, and resistance to warp predation. This system had evolved over generations of trial and error before Magnus' arrival and was further refined under his guidance. The Prosperine approach to psychic training emphasized defensive techniques first, mental shielding, energy containment, and meditation practices that stabilized the connection between mind and warp. Only after mastering these fundamentals would students progress to active applications of their abilities. This cautious methodology resulted in a remarkably low rate of possession or psychic accidents compared to other human populations with similar psychic potential. The Great Library stood at the center of this educational system, providing both historical context and theoretical frameworks for understanding psychic phenomena. Students progressed through clearly defined ranks, each granting access to more advanced knowledge. The highest levels of training were reserved for those who demonstrated not just psychic strength, but also the wisdom and moral character to wield such power responsibly. The Thousand Sons viewed themselves as protectors of human psychic potential throughout the galaxy. They maintained networks of contacts on worlds with high concentrations of psychers, often identifying and recruiting promising individuals before they came to the attention of the black ships that collected psychers for Terra. This practice was technically within their rights as a legion, but created tension with other imperial organizations tasked with psycher oversight. When encountering human populations with significant psychic presence during the Great Crusade, the Thousand Sons would often advocate for specialized compliance protocols that preserved local psychic traditions they deemed valuable or safe. In some cases, they established satellite academies modeled on Prosperine training methods to help these populations develop their gifts constructively within the imperial framework. This protective stance extended to intervention when they discovered psychers being persecuted on imperial worlds. The Thousand Sons viewed such treatment as both a humanitarian failing and a waste of valuable human potential. Their intercessions, while well-intentioned, sometimes put them at odds with local planetary governments and even other imperial organizations who viewed all unsanctioned psychers with suspicion. The pursuit of arcane knowledge and psychic mastery defined the Thousand Sons more than any other legion. While all Astartes were warriors without peer, the Sons of Magnus cultivated abilities that transcended conventional warfare, organizing their psychic disciplines into a sophisticated system of 9 great cults. This structure allowed for specialized training while ensuring that the legion maintained a cohesive psychic doctrine. The Corvidae, perhaps the most influential of the cults, specialized in divination and foresight. Their abilities ranged from battlefield precognition to long-term strategic planning based on possible futures. A skilled Corvidae could track the tangled threads of fate, identifying crucial decision points and optimal paths to victory. In battle, they served as tactical advisors, warning of enemy movements before they occurred and guiding their brothers to positions of advantage. Their symbol, the raven, represented both wisdom and the ability to see what others could not. Azek Ahriman, first captain of the Legion and chief librarian, led this cult with unparalleled mastery of its disciplines. The Piri cult harnessed the raw energies of the warp, manifesting primarily as control over fire and heat. On the battlefield, Piri adepts could ignite enemy fortifications with a gesture, melt through armored bulkheads, or create corridors of protective heat that deflected incoming projectiles. Their abilities extended beyond simple destruction. Skilled practitioners could regulate thermal conditions to preserve delicate artifacts or sustain legion operations in extreme environments. The Piri symbol of the phoenix represented both their destructive capacity and the transformative nature of fire. The Pavoni specialized in biomancy, the manipulation of living tissue. Their abilities included accelerated healing, enhancement of physical attributes, and in combat, the capacity to induce catastrophic biological failure in enemies. Pavoni cultists could increase their strength and speed beyond even Astartes' norms, seal wounds in the midst of battle, or cause enemy combatants to suffer seizures or cellular breakdown. This mastery of biological processes made them invaluable both as combat specialists and as adjuncts to the Legion's apothecaries. Their symbol, the peacock, represented physical perfection and transformation. The Raptora cult focused on telekinesis, developing techniques to manipulate physical matter with the mind. In battle, they created kinetic shields that could stop everything from bullets to artillery shells, while simultaneously using their powers offensively to crush enemy positions or hurl debris as improvised weapons. The most skilled Raptora adepts could maintain multiple telekinetic effects simultaneously, protecting their battle brothers while tearing apart enemy fortifications. Their hawk symbol represented precision and mastery over the physical world. The Athenian cult specialized in telepathy, developing techniques for mind reading, memory extraction, and psychic communication. During compliance actions, they served as interrogators and translators, gleaning crucial information from captured enemies or facilitating negotiations with human populations. In combat, they could disrupt enemy communications, sow confusion in opposing forces, or even temporarily overwhelm hostile minds with psychic static. Their symbol, the owl, represented wisdom and the ability to see in darkness, in this case, the darkness of others' thoughts. Less prominent but equally important were the 4 remaining cults: the Athenian cult of telepathic arts, the Raptora cult specializing in telekinesis, the Piri cult focusing on pyrokinesis, and the Corvidae cult dedicated to divination and foresight. The Thousand Sons also maintained several smaller disciplines, including the Kalapoja, masters of animal communion, the Ethegis, specialists in warding and protection, the Serenunos, practitioners of illusion and misdirection, and the Anubieks, experts in death sense and spirit communication. Each cult maintained its own training protocols, meditation techniques, and focus rituals. Initiates would be assigned to a cult based on their natural proclivities, though cross-training was encouraged once mastery of a primary discipline was achieved. The most accomplished Thousand Sons could draw upon multiple psychic disciplines, though such versatility typically came at the cost of the specialized mastery achieved by dedicated cult members. The framework for these psychic disciplines came from Magnus' development of the enumerations, a series of mental exercises and meditative states that allowed for controlled access to psychic abilities. Each enumeration represented a deeper level of connection to the warp, with corresponding increases in both power and risk. A battle brother operating at the first enumeration might manifest minor precognitive flashes or telepathic impressions, while one who had achieved the 8th or 9th enumeration could unleash devastating psychic attacks or perceive events occurring light years away. The enumerations served multiple purposes beyond simply categorizing power levels. They provided a structured progression for psychic development, ensuring that legionaries mastered fundamental control techniques before attempting more dangerous applications. They also functioned as a safety mechanism. A thousand son who felt his control slipping could step down to a lower enumeration, reducing the flow of warp energy through his mind until stability was restored. Each enumeration involved specific breathing patterns, visualization exercises, and mental configurations. The first enumeration taught basic warp awareness and psychic shielding. The 2nd through 4th developed specific applications within a chosen discipline. The 5th and 6th expanded perception beyond normal space-time limitations. The 7th through 9th granted access to the deepest mysteries of the warp, allowing for effects that bordered on reality manipulation. Achieving the higher enumerations required years of disciplined practice. Even among the psychically gifted Thousand Sons, only a minority ever mastered the 8th, and fewer still attained the 9th. Magnus himself operated beyond these classifications, his Primarch physiology and inherent connection to the warp placing him in a category of his own. In practical terms, the enumerations transformed how the Thousand Sons approached warfare. A battle brother entering combat would typically establish himself at the appropriate enumeration based on the threat level and his assigned role. Scout operations might require only the subtle awareness of the 1st or 2nd enumeration, while major engagements could see entire fellowships ascending to the 5th or 6th to unleash their full potential. The combination of cult specialization and enumeration techniques created a uniquely flexible fighting force. Unlike conventional Astartes who were limited to physical weapons and tactics, the Thousand Sons could adapt their capabilities to meet almost any challenge. Facing heavily armored opponents, Pavoni cultists could identify and exploit weak points in enemy physiology. Encountering superior numbers, Raptora adepts could create choke points with telekinetic barriers, while Piri specialists laid down corridors of flame. This adaptability extended beyond combat applications. The Thousand Sons approached compliance actions with a toolkit of options unavailable to other legions. Resistant planetary governments might find their leaders experiencing prophetic dreams urging cooperation, courtesy of Corvidae interventions. Hostile populations could be pacified through subtle telepathic calming projected by Athenian adepts. When conventional imperial forces might need to resort to bombardment or protracted siege, the Thousand Sons could often achieve compliance through more surgical psychic operations. The Legion's combat doctrine integrated these psychic capabilities with traditional Astartes tactics in a system they called the syntaxis, the harmonious combination of physical and metaphysical warfare. Under this doctrine, conventional military assets worked in precise coordination with psychic specialists to create effects greater than either could achieve alone. A typical Thousand Sons assault might begin with Corvidae augurs identifying critical weaknesses in enemy positions through precognitive scanning. Raptora adepts would then establish telekinetic corridors through which conventional tactical squads could advance with minimal exposure to enemy fire. As the main force engaged, Pavoni biomancers would enhance their brothers' physical capabilities while simultaneously inducing fatigue or disorientation in enemy combatants. Piri cult members would provide fire support, igniting key targets or creating walls of flame to channel enemy movements. This integrated approach made the Thousand Sons extraordinarily efficient in compliance actions. They typically achieved their objectives with minimal casualties on both sides and limited collateral damage, a point of pride for a legion that valued knowledge and saw needless destruction as wasteful. Their precision stood in stark contrast to the overwhelming force employed by legions like the World Eaters or Death Guard. However, this efficiency came with costs. The psychic exertion required by the syntaxis placed tremendous strain on the legion's psychically active members. Extended campaigns often required rotation of psychic specialists to prevent exhaustion or dangerous lapses in concentration. The Legion also maintained a higher proportion of support personnel compared to other Astartes forces, including mortal scholars who managed the extensive intelligence gathering necessary to optimize their operations. The Thousand Suns exploration of the Great Ocean, their preferred term for the immaterium or warp, went far beyond the utilitarian applications of combat psychery. Magnus encouraged his sons to understand the fundamental nature of this parallel realm, believing that true mastery required comprehensive knowledge rather than simple technique. This philosophical approach led to the development of various metaphysical frameworks for conceptualizing the warp. The Thousand Suns understood it not as a chaotic hell dimension, as it was often characterized by more superstitious imperial factions, but as a complex realm of pure energy and consciousness that mirrored and interacted with physical space. They recognized patterns within its apparent randomness and studied the relationship between emotional states in real space and corresponding manifestations in the immaterium. Through careful observation and controlled experimentation, the Legion mapped currents and eddies within the Great Ocean, identifying stable pathways that could be navigated safely. They cataloged various types of warp entities, developing classification systems based on behavior patterns and apparent motivations. This research extended to the nature of demons, though the Thousand Suns carefully avoided using this culturally loaded term, preferring tutelaries or empyreal entities in their academic discussions. The Legion maintained specialized research fellowships dedicated to particular aspects of warp study. The Miscellanics investigated the physical laws governing the immaterium. The Xenomantes studied non-human psychic traditions for useful techniques. The Apotropaics focused on protective measures against hostile warp entities. Each fellowship maintained extensive records of their findings, creating a body of knowledge unprecedented in its scope and detail. This pursuit of forbidden knowledge placed the Thousand Suns in an increasingly precarious position as the Great Crusade progressed. While the Emperor had initially encouraged psychic development within the Legion's Astartes through the Librarius program, growing concerns about the dangers of the warp led to increasing restrictions. The Council of Nicaea would eventually bring these tensions to a head, but long before that formal council, the Thousand Suns found their research viewed with suspicion by their brother legions. Particularly vocal in their opposition were the Space Wolves, Death Guard, and Imperial Fists, whose Primarchs harbored deep misgivings about warp manipulation. Leman Russ of the Space Wolves derisively referred to the Thousand Suns' practices as sorcery, a characterization that Magnus vehemently rejected. In his view, there was a crucial distinction between the disciplined, scientific approach his legion practiced and the uncontrolled, ritualistic manipulations that properly constituted sorcery. This distinction became increasingly important as the Thousand Suns encountered evidence of actual sorceress cults during compliance actions. These groups typically employed blood sacrifice, possession, and other dangerous techniques to achieve their ends. The Thousand Suns took particular care to eliminate such cults, seeing them as both a threat to imperial stability and a dangerous misapplication of warp knowledge that reflected poorly on legitimate psychic practice. Despite these efforts to maintain a clear separation between their scholarly pursuits and prohibited sorcery, the lines sometimes blurred in practice. The Thousand Suns' research occasionally led them to experiment with techniques that pushed the boundaries of what the broader Imperium considered acceptable. Ritual focusing methods, symbolic visualization systems, and the use of physical components to stabilize psychic effects all resembled the trappings of ceremonial magic, even when employed with scientific understanding. The use of tutelaries exemplified this ambiguity. These warp entities, bound through complex psychic techniques, served as assistants and amplifiers for the Legion psychers. A Thousand Sun might summon his personal tutelary to enhance specific abilities or provide information about warp conditions. The Legion maintained that these were benign entities carefully controlled through their advanced understanding of the immaterium, but to outside observers, the practice appeared dangerously similar to demon binding. Magnus defended these practices by emphasizing the rigorous safeguards his Legion employed. Every interaction with the warp was preceded by extensive preparation, including specialized meditation techniques, the establishment of psychic wards, and peer monitoring to detect signs of corruption. The Primarch himself reviewed the most advanced research and prohibited lines of inquiry he deemed too dangerous. In his view, knowledge itself was never the problem, only its misapplication by the unprepared or unworthy. This nuanced position proved difficult to maintain in the increasingly polarized climate of the later Great Crusade. As concerns about warp contamination grew throughout the Imperium, the Thousand Suns found themselves increasingly isolated. Their insistence on the value of controlled warp study ran counter to the growing imperial orthodoxy that viewed the immaterium primarily as a source of corruption to be avoided rather than understood. The growing tensions between the Thousand Suns and their brother legions did not emerge suddenly, but rather built gradually throughout the Great Crusade. As Magnus and his legion delved deeper into their psychic practices, the distrust from certain quarters of the Imperium intensified proportionally. At the forefront of this opposition stood Mortarion of the Death Guard and Leman Russ of the Space Wolves, two Primarchs whose backgrounds had instilled in them a deep suspicion of anything resembling sorcery. Mortarion's hostility stemmed from his formative experiences on Barbarus, a toxic world ruled by warp-wielding overlords who had used their powers to subjugate the human population. Having fought against these witch lords and witnessed firsthand the corrupting influence of unchecked psychic power, Mortarion viewed all warp manipulation with deep suspicion. The methodical, disciplined approach of the Thousand Suns did little to assuage his concerns. To Mortarion, the trappings of scholarship merely disguised the same fundamental dangers. When the Death Guard and Thousand Suns found themselves assigned to joint compliance actions, the friction between their approaches became immediately apparent. During the compliance of Aghoru, Mortarion openly questioned Magnus' methods when the Crimson King attempted to peacefully commune with the psychically active Xenos entities found within the massive subterranean chambers of that world. What Magnus saw as an opportunity for understanding, Mortarion perceived as reckless endangerment of Imperial forces. Leman Russ approached the issue from a different perspective, but arrived at similar conclusions. The culture of Fenris had long maintained traditions regarding witches and warlocks, viewing unsanctioned psychic activity as dangerous and dishonorable. While the Space Wolves themselves employed rune priests who wielded powers remarkably similar to those of the Thousand Suns librarians, Russ maintained that these abilities derived from the spirit of Fenris itself, rather than the corrupting influence of the warp. This distinction, which Magnus viewed as semantic hypocrisy, became a point of bitter contention between the two Primarchs. During the Arc-Reach Cluster campaign, tensions escalated when rune priests openly condemned the Thousand Suns' practices as they jointly prosecuted compliance actions against well-defended hive cities. Magnus attempted to demonstrate the precision and control of his legion's methods, using targeted psychic attacks to disable enemy command structures while minimizing civilian casualties. Russ remained unimpressed, preferring the direct approach of his wolves even when it resulted in greater collateral damage. The friction extended beyond these two prominent critics. Rogel Dorn of the Imperial Fists harbored deep reservations about psychic warfare, viewing it as unreliable compared to conventional military tactics. Corvus Corax of the Raven Guard questioned the ethical implications of mental manipulation, even when employed against enemies of the Imperium. Lion Eljonson of the Dark Angels maintained a more pragmatic stance, acknowledging the utility of psychic abilities while expressing concern about their potential for corruption. Not all Primarchs shared these misgivings. Jagatai Khan of the White Scars employed his own corps of Stormseers, psychers whose traditions paralleled certain aspects of Thousand Suns' practice. Magnus found in the Khan a more sympathetic ear, though even Jagatai maintained certain reservations about the depth of the Crimson King's explorations. Lorgar of the Word-Bearers initially showed great interest in the Thousand Sons research, frequently engaging Magnus in philosophical discussions about the nature of the warp and its relationship to humanity's future. The Thousand Sons did themselves few favors in how they responded to this growing suspicion. Magnus, convinced of the righteousness of his approach, often displayed intellectual arrogance when challenged. Rather than acknowledging the legitimate concerns of his brothers, he tended to dismiss them as products of ignorance or superstition. This condescension, however unintentional, only widened the gulf between the Thousand Sons and their critics. Within the Legion, attitudes varied. Some, like First Captain Ozek Ariman, advocated for a more diplomatic approach, suggesting that the Thousand Sons should moderate their more controversial practices or at least be more discreet in their application. Others, like the fiery Phocis Tikar, captain of the Second Fellowship, bristled at any suggestion that they should compromise their pursuit of knowledge to appease what he viewed as primitive superstition. The situation deteriorated further following several high-profile incidents that seemed to validate the concerns of the anti-Psyker faction. During the compliance of Oraxi, a Thousand Sons librarian lost control during a psychic assault, resulting in a catastrophic warp breach that claimed the lives of an entire company of Imperial Army troops. Though the Legion implemented stricter protocols in response, the damage to their reputation was already done. More damaging still was the Kamenka Troika campaign, where the Thousand Sons fought alongside the Space Wolves against well-entrenched Xenos forces. When Magnus employed a powerful psychic technique to collapse a critical enemy strongpoint, the resulting warp disturbance triggered a series of unexpected phenomena, including mass hallucinations among nearby Imperial forces and the temporary possession of several mortal auxiliaries. Though the Thousand Sons quickly contained the situation, Leman Russ used the incident as evidence that even the most controlled psychic techniques carried unacceptable risks. As reports of such incidents reached Terra, concerns began to emerge at the highest levels of Imperial authority. The Emperor, who had initially encouraged the development of the Librarius program across multiple legions, now seemed to reconsider his position. Malkador the Sigilite, the Emperor's most trusted advisor, began collecting testimony regarding the use of psychic powers in military operations, with particular attention to cases where such usage had led to unexpected complications. Several Primarchs, led by Mortarion, formally petitioned for restrictions on Legion's psychic practices. They argued that while the Emperor himself wielded immense psychic power, his unique nature and understanding made such usage fundamentally different from that of lesser beings, even Astartes. The comparison between the Emperor's psychic mastery and that of Legion librarians, they maintained, was akin to comparing a master artificer's plasma reactor to a crude atomic device cobbled together by feral worlders. Both harnessed similar energies, but with vastly different levels of safety and control. Magnus, alerted to these developments through both official channels and his own psychic foresight, began preparing a comprehensive defense of his Legion's practices. He compiled extensive documentation of successful compliance actions, where psychic techniques had reduced casualties and preserved valuable knowledge. He gathered testimony from Imperial commanders who had witnessed the effectiveness of librarian interventions in critical battles. Most importantly, he developed a detailed theoretical framework explaining the differences between the disciplined, scientific approach of the Thousand Sons and the dangerous, uncontrolled sorcery practiced by various cults they had encountered and eliminated. The Emperor, recognizing the growing schism within his forces, decreed that the matter would be settled through formal debate. He ordered the convening of a conclave on the remote world of Nicaea, a planet chosen for its neutrality and isolation. All Primarchs were commanded to attend, along with representatives from each legion, the Mechanicum, and various other Imperial organizations with stakes in the outcome. This gathering would come to be known as the Council of Nicaea, a pivotal moment in Imperial history whose repercussions would echo far beyond the question of psychic practice. The physical setting of the council reflected its solemn purpose. The Emperor commanded the construction of a massive amphitheater, carved into the side of a mountain, on Nikia's northern continent. The structure combined elements of ancient Terran design with the architectural grandiosity of the Great Crusade era. Tiered seating surrounded a central speaking floor, with special chambers prepared for the Emperor and his Primarchs. Acoustics were carefully engineered so that even a whisper from the central podium could be heard throughout the vast space. As the Imperial representatives arrived, the divisions were immediately apparent. The Death Guard and Space Wolves contingents pointedly established their quarters at a distance from the Thousand Suns delegation. The word bearers, once friendly toward Magnus Legion, now maintained a conspicuous neutrality. The White Scars positioned themselves as mediators, maintaining cordial relations with both factions while reserving judgment on the matters at hand. The council began with formal presentations from both sides of the debate. Speaking for the anti-Psyker faction, Mortarion delivered a powerful indictment of warp manipulation in all its forms. He recounted his experiences on Barbaros, where psychic overlords had used their powers to enslave and torment the human population. He detailed incidents from the Great Crusade where psychic phenomena had led to unnecessary casualties or compromised Imperial objectives. Most pointedly, he questioned whether any human mind, even one enhanced by Astartes conditioning, could safely interact with the fundamental forces of the Immaterium. Leman Russ followed with a more direct attack on the practices of the Thousand Suns specifically. He characterized their techniques as reckless experimentation that prioritized the acquisition of knowledge over the safety of Imperial forces. The Space Wolves Primarch drew a sharp distinction between what he termed natural psychic abilities, like those employed by his rune priests, who drew their power from the world spirit of Fenris, and the unnatural manipulations practiced by Magnus Legion, which he claimed involved trafficking with entities from beyond the material realm. Magnus listened to these accusations with growing frustration, recognizing the fundamental misunderstandings that underpinned them. When his turn came to speak, he approached the central podium with a carefully prepared defense. He began by acknowledging the legitimate dangers of uncontrolled psychic activity, citing the Thousand Suns' own efforts to eliminate sorceress cults encountered during compliance actions. He then methodically outlined the safeguards his legion had developed, from the structured progression of the enumerations to the peer monitoring systems that ensured no Battle Brother's abilities exceeded his control. The Crimson King drew upon historical examples where psychic intervention had decisively turned the tide of battle in the Imperium's favor. He presented statistical analyses showing that compliance actions involving librarian support typically resulted in fewer casualties on both sides compared to purely conventional operations. Most passionately, he argued that humanity's psychic potential represented not a threat to be suppressed, but the species' evolutionary destiny, a future that the Emperor himself had foreseen and was guiding humanity toward. Magnus reserved his most pointed remarks for what he viewed as the hypocrisy of his accusers. He questioned how the rune priests of the Space Wolves could be considered fundamentally different from the librarians of other legions, when the observable effects of their powers were virtually identical. The distinction between drawing power from the world's spirit versus the Immaterium, he suggested, was meaningless when examined through the lens of objective reality rather than cultural mythology. As the formal presentations concluded, the council moved to open debate. Representatives from various legions offered their perspectives, creating a complex tapestry of viewpoints that defied simple categorization. Jagatai Khan spoke of the Chagorian traditions that had informed the White Scars' approach to psychic ability, emphasizing the importance of balance and restraint rather than outright prohibition. Sanguinius of the Blood Angels acknowledged the risks of warp interaction, while suggesting that properly trained psychers represented an asset the Imperium could ill afford to discard. Malkador, the Sigilite, offered a historical perspective, recounting the old night when uncontrolled psychic awakening had contributed to humanity's fall from its dark age of technology heights. He reminded the assembly that the Emperor's own policies regarding psychers had always been carefully nuanced, neither embracing unrestricted development nor mandating complete suppression. Throughout the proceedings, the Emperor himself remained largely silent, his immense presence a constant reminder of what was at stake. Only occasionally did he interject to clarify a point or redirect a line of questioning that strayed too far from the central issues. His inscrutable expression gave no indication of which arguments had swayed him, if any. As the council entered its final phase, tension within the amphitheater reached a palpable level. Magnus made one last impassioned plea for understanding, warning that to deny humanity's psychic potential was to condemn the species to stagnation and eventual decline. Mortarion countered with an equally fervent argument that the risks of unrestricted psychic practice threatened not just individual practitioners, but the entirety of human civilization. When all arguments had been presented, the Emperor rose from his throne. The amphitheater fell into absolute silence as he moved to the central podium, his golden armor catching the light in a way that seemed to illuminate the entire chamber. What followed was not the nuanced ruling many had expected, but rather a clear and unambiguous decree. The librarious divisions of all legions were to be disbanded immediately. The practice of psychic powers by Astartes was prohibited throughout the Imperium. Those with psychic abilities were to cease using them and return to conventional combat roles within their respective legions. The Emperor drew a clear distinction between the controlled use of psychic abilities by specially trained and sanctioned individuals under his direct authority, such as the astropaths who maintained interstellar communication and the navigators who guided ships through the warp, and the broader application of such powers within the legions Astartes. The former remained necessary for the functioning of the Imperium. The latter, he now declared, presented risks that outweighed their tactical advantages. Most pointedly, the Emperor specifically condemned the practices of the Thousand Sons, stating that much of what they termed scholarly research crossed the line into sorcery, a practice he had always forbidden. He ordered Magnus to cease all such activities immediately and to surrender the Legion's collections of psychic lore to imperial authorities for evaluation and possible destruction. The ruling fell like a thunderbolt across the assembly. The anti-psyker faction could scarcely contain their satisfaction, while the Thousand Sons delegation sat in stunned silence. Magnus himself remained outwardly composed, though those closest to him could see the profound shock and disappointment behind his single eye. The Emperor had not merely restricted certain controversial practices, he had repudiated the fundamental principles around which Magnus had built his legion's identity. As the council dispersed, the Primarchs and their retinues prepared to return to their respective commands and implement the Emperor's decree. Outwardly, Magnus accepted the ruling with appropriate deference, publicly instructing his sons to comply fully with their father's commands. He spoke of the Thousand Sons' continued loyalty to the imperial vision and their willingness to adapt their methods in service to that greater cause. Privately, however, Magnus seethed with a complex mixture of emotions, disappointment, frustration, and a growing sense of betrayal. He believed that the Emperor, more than anyone, should have understood the value of the knowledge his legion had accumulated and the care with which they had pursued their studies. The blanket condemnation of their work as sorcery struck him as not merely unfair but fundamentally inaccurate, a judgment based on fear and misunderstanding rather than a true evaluation of their methods. Upon returning to Prospero, Magnus secluded himself in his private chambers within the pyramid of Phodup. For days, he communed with his closest advisors, weighing their options in light of the Emperor's decree. Some, like Ozek Ariman, counseled full compliance, suggesting that the Legion could continue its intellectual traditions while abstaining from active psychic practice. Others argued that certain research could continue discreetly, particularly work focused on theoretical understanding rather than practical application. In the end, Magnus made a fateful decision that would alter the course of imperial history. While outwardly appearing to comply with the Emperor's edict, he determined that the Thousand Sons would continue their most important psychic practices in secret. The pursuit of knowledge that he believed essential to humanity's future could not be abandoned because of what he viewed as temporary political considerations. The Emperor, Magnus reasoned, would eventually recognize the value of their work and rescind the restrictions once the current climate of fear had passed. This decision, made with what Magnus believed were the noblest of intentions, set the Thousand Suns on a collision course with Imperial authority. As they implemented elaborate measures to conceal their continued psychic activities, conducting research in shielded chambers deep within the Pyramid of Phodop, communicating through coded references in seemingly innocuous scholarly works, training new initiates under the guise of theoretical historical study, they moved further from the path of compliance that could have preserved them. Magnus justified these actions to himself and his inner circle as necessary sacrifices in service to a higher truth. The knowledge they preserved and expanded would, he believed, ultimately prove crucial to the Emperor's grand design for humanity's evolution. In his pride and certainty, he failed to consider that his defiance might be perceived not as principled resistance, but as dangerous betrayal, a perception that would have catastrophic consequences when the storms of the Horus heresy began to gather on the horizon. The psychic shock of the Council of Nicaea's verdict reverberated through the Thousand Suns Legion with devastating impact. Though they maintained disciplined exteriors, the Sons of Magnus felt the Emperor's decree as a fundamental rejection of their identity, while other legions could simply shutter their librarious divisions and continue their primary combat doctrines unaffected. For the Thousand Suns, psychic mastery wasn't merely a tactical advantage, it formed the core of their existence. Back on Prospero, Magnus retreated into increasingly esoteric studies. His outward compliance with the Emperor's edict masked a deepening conviction that he alone truly understood the threats gathering in the great ocean. The Crimson King spent long periods in seclusion within his personal observatory atop the Pyramid of Phodop. There, surrounded by ancient tomes and crystalline focusing devices, he cast his consciousness farther into the warp than ever before, searching for understanding that might vindicate his legion's path. It was during one such deep meditation that Magnus first perceived the unthinkable, psychic emanations suggesting treachery within the Imperial inner circle. His initial discoveries were fragmented and unclear, emotional impressions of rage and ambition, flickering visions of familiar faces distorted by shadows, and cryptic symbolic patterns that hinted at conspiracy. Disturbed but determined, Magnus intensified his efforts, pushing his formidable psychic abilities to their limits to pierce the veil of secrecy. What he discovered shattered his world. Through the swirling currents of the warp, Magnus witnessed Horus Lupercal, Warmaster of the Imperium and most favored son of the Emperor, in communion with entities that could only be described as demonic. The Warmaster, grievously wounded on the moon of Davin, had allowed himself to be healed through rituals that opened his mind and soul to corruption. Now, Horus plotted the unimaginable, open rebellion against the Emperor. The visions showed Magnus fleets repositioning under false orders, supply chains being quietly redirected, and communications being intercepted and altered. Most horrifying were the glimpses of other Primarchs being drawn into Horus's web of treachery, some through deception, others through the exploitation of long-harbored resentments. The scale of the conspiracy staggered Magnus. This wasn't merely a military coup, but an existential threat to everything the Great Crusade had built. The immediacy of this threat overshadowed all other concerns in Magnus's mind. The Emperor needed to be warned, regardless of the consequences to Magnus himself or the restrictions placed on his legion's psychic activities. With the fate of the Imperium hanging in the balance, the Nicaea Edict seemed trivial by comparison. What was the punishment for violating a ban on psychic communication compared to allowing the Emperor to be blindsided by the greatest betrayal in human history? Magnus gathered his closest advisors to discuss what he had discovered, but notably did not reveal his intended response. Ozek Ahriman and several other senior captains urged caution, suggesting that such critical intelligence should be delivered by the Legion's fastest vessels, carrying written testimony that would not violate the spirit of Nicaea. Others proposed reaching out to loyal Primarchs who might serve as intermediaries. These measured approaches would take time, however, and Magnus had grown convinced that every moment counted. Dismissing his advisors, Magnus returned to his sanctum and began preparations for what would become the most catastrophic psychic working of his life. He gathered focusing crystals from across Prospero, arranged them in precise geometric patterns to amplify his already formidable powers, and consumed rare elixirs designed to heighten psychic sensitivity. As night fell over Tizca, he began the ritual that would send his consciousness across the immense gulf separating Prospero from Terra. This was no simple astropathic communication. Magnus intended to project his entire psychic presence across the galaxy, creating a direct link to the Imperial Palace that would allow him to share everything he had witnessed with perfect clarity. Such a working would normally be impossible, even for a being of Magnus's capabilities. The distances involved and the turbulent nature of the warp created barriers that no single psyker could overcome. What Magnus failed to consider was why such communications were impossible and what forces had carefully maintained those barriers. The Emperor had established a psychic shield around Terra, not merely to protect the throne world from hostile warp entities, but to conceal his most secret and vulnerable project, the Imperial Webway. Deep beneath the Imperial Palace, the Emperor had been laboring to create a human-accessible portion of the ancient Eldar transportation network, a system that would free humanity from dependence on warp travel and its attendant risks. This delicate undertaking required the Emperor's constant attention, maintaining psychic wards that separated the half-constructed webway portal from the predatory entities of the warp. Any disruption to these wards could prove catastrophic, potentially opening Terra itself to demonic incursion. It was precisely this risk that had informed the Emperor's decision at Nicaea. The proliferation of untrained or undisciplined psychers created vulnerabilities in the fabric of reality that his grand project could not afford. Ignorant of these crucial details, Magnus proceeded with his desperate gambit. Channeling power beyond anything he had previously attempted, he forced his psychic presence through the warp toward Terra. The barriers thinned before his onslaught, but did not yield completely. Frustrated and increasingly desperate, Magnus unconsciously reached for assistance, drawing on the same entities he had long convinced himself were benign sources of knowledge. These powers, aspects of Tzinch that had cultivated Magnus's pride and hubris for decades, eagerly provided the additional strength he needed. With their aid, Magnus shattered the psychic barriers protecting Terra and established his connection to the Emperor. In that moment of seeming triumph, he failed to perceive how his actions had torn a catastrophic breach in the Emperor's carefully constructed wards around the Webway project. The message itself reached the Emperor with perfect clarity. Every detail of Horus's treachery, every nuance of the conspiracy, flowed directly into the Emperor's consciousness. But this success came at an unimaginable price. The breach Magnus had created allowed warp entities to pour into the human section of the Webway, overwhelming the custodian guards stationed there and threatening to create a permanent warp rift in the heart of Terra itself. The Emperor, forced to abandon crucial work to deal with this new crisis, felt a rage unlike any he had known since the scattering of his Primarchs. The warning about Horus, while valuable, now competed with an immediate existential threat to the throne world itself. Magnus had not merely disobeyed the Nicaea Edict, he had inadvertently compromised humanity's future as the Emperor had envisioned it. In the aftermath of his psychic sending, Magnus collapsed into unconsciousness, drained by the immense effort. When he awoke, the full horror of what he had done began to dawn on him. The entities that had assisted him revealed themselves more clearly, showing him visions of the breach he had created and the consequences now unfolding on Terra. Far from saving the Imperium, he had created a second devastating crisis that divided the Emperor's attention at the worst possible moment. Magnus withdrew into isolated despair, ignoring the concerned inquiries of his captains. His pride, once so towering, crumbled as he confronted the possibility that his critics had been right all along, that his confidence in his ability to safely navigate the warp had been hubris of the highest order. For perhaps the first time, the Crimson King faced the prospect that his entire philosophical approach might have been fundamentally flawed. On Terra, the Emperor made a cold calculation. The breach in the Webway required his immediate and ongoing attention to prevent a full-scale demonic incursion into the Imperial Palace. He could not personally leave Terra to deal with either Horus's betrayal or Magnus's transgression. Instead, he summoned Leman Russ, Primarch of the Space Wolves, to the throne world. The Emperor's instructions to Russ have been a subject of debate among Imperial historians for millennia. What is clear is that Russ was ordered to bring Magnus to Terra to account for his actions. What remains contested is whether the emperor explicitly ordered Magnus's arrest or his execution. The ambiguity may have been intentional, allowing the emperor deniability regardless of the outcome, or it may have resulted from miscommunication, exacerbated by the influence of those already working to deepen the divisions within the Imperium. Whatever the exact wording, Russ interpreted his mandate in the harshest possible terms. His long-standing suspicion of Magnus and the Thousand Sons, combined with his natural predisposition toward direct action, led him to prepare for a punitive expedition rather than a mere apprehension. The Wolf King assembled a substantial force, including nearly his entire legion, elements from the Silent Sisterhood whose null abilities would counteract Thousand Sons' psychic powers, and a contingent of custodian guard to represent the Emperor's authority. As this force mustered, Horus, now fully committed to his treacherous path, saw an opportunity to eliminate 2 loyal legions in a single stroke. Through careful manipulation, the War Master reinforced Russ's worst assumptions about Magnus, suggesting that the Crimson King had always intended to betray the Emperor, and that the psychic sending was merely a feint designed to lower Terra's defenses. He implied that the Emperor's true wishes, which political considerations prevented him from stating explicitly, were for the elimination of Magnus and his legion. Russ, predisposed to believe the worst of his psychically gifted brother, accepted these insinuations without sufficient scrutiny. What might have been a mission to arrest a wayward Primarch transformed into preparations for a punitive massacre. The Space Wolves set course for Prospero, their purpose no longer to retrieve Magnus but to execute him and exterminate his legion. On Prospero, Magnus gradually emerged from his self-imposed isolation, but not to organize a defense. Having seen the approaching retribution through his psychic abilities, he made perhaps the most controversial decision of his troubled existence. He would accept destruction as penance for his failure. Not only would he not resist, but he would actively prevent his legion from effectively defending themselves. Without explaining his reasoning, Magnus ordered the Thousand Sons to disable Prospero's orbital defense grid and planetary shields. He sent the majority of the fleet on training exercises far from the system, leaving the planet virtually defenseless. When questioned about these inexplicable commands, he offered only cryptic statements about accepting the consequences of our choices that left his sons confused and concerned. Only Ozek Ahriman and a few other senior captains recognized the suicidal nature of these preparations. They pleaded with their Primarch to reconsider, arguing that whatever his personal feelings of guilt, he had no right to condemn the entire legion to destruction without giving them the chance to defend themselves. Magnus remained unmoved, commanding absolute compliance and retreating once more into seclusion. As the Space Wolves' fleet translated from the warp at the edge of the Prospero system, they expected to encounter resistance. Finding none, Leman Russ grew suspicious rather than relieved. To him, the absence of defensive preparations suggested not compliance, but a trap, further evidence of Magnus's treachery. He ordered an immediate and overwhelming assault rather than any attempt at communication or negotiation. The attack began with a massive orbital bombardment that caught the citizens of Tizca completely by surprise. Prospero had known 10,000 years of peace before becoming the Thousand Sons' home world, and its civilian population had no concept of the violence about to engulf them. Macro cannon shells and torpedo barrages rained down on the unshielded city, transforming the crystal spires and marble colonnades into murderous shrapnel. Entire districts collapsed in seconds, burying thousands of civilians and scholars under tons of debris. The Thousand Sons, stunned by this unexpected onslaught and hampered by their Primarch's inexplicable orders, struggled to mount even a basic defense. Squad leaders tried to organize evacuation efforts for civilians while simultaneously attempting to establish defensive positions with whatever weapons were readily available. The lack of preparation created chaos that compounded the devastation of the bombardment. As Prospero burned, Magnus watched from his pyramid, psychically experiencing the death of each citizen and battle brother, but still refusing to intervene. Only when Ozek Ahriman and several other captains declared that they would organize a defense with or without his blessing did Magnus finally relent, releasing his sons from his orders, but still refusing to personally join the battle. With the orbital bombardment lifting, the Space Wolves and their allies made planetfall in massive drop pod assaults and gunship insertions. The Thousand Suns, finally free to defend themselves, rallied with remarkable speed despite the chaos. Centuries of disciplined training allowed them to form effective combat units even as their city collapsed around them. Fellowship captains established command centers in still-standing structures, prioritizing the evacuation of civilians toward the spaceports while preparing to slow the Space Wolves' advance. The battle for Tizca quickly devolved into dozens of desperate last stands as the Thousand Suns found themselves hopelessly outnumbered. The Silent Sisters proved particularly devastating to the defenders, their null auras creating zones where the Thousand Suns' psychic abilities simply ceased to function. Many battle brothers, accustomed to relying on their powers, found themselves suddenly vulnerable, their combat effectiveness drastically reduced. Despite these disadvantages, the Thousand Suns fought with determination and tactical acumen. The Piri cult turned debris fields into death traps of superheated metal. Raptora adepts used telekinetic shields to protect evacuation routes. Athenian telepaths coordinated defense efforts across isolated pockets of resistance. For every Thousand Suns battle brother that fell, they claimed multiple attackers, fighting with the desperate knowledge that this was not merely a battle, but an extinction event for their legion. The most poignant confrontations occurred around the city's libraries and research facilities. Thousand Suns squads made suicidal stands to allow fellow battle brothers to evacuate irreplaceable texts and artifacts. In the Museum of Cultural Relics, the Third Fellowship held off an entire company of Space Wolves, while scholars loaded ancient manuscripts onto the last remaining transports. At the Nephrate Library, Captain Phosis Tikar and his warriors fought to the last man, protecting knowledge collected from 100 worlds. As the battle raged through Tizca's burning streets, Magnus finally emerged from his pyramid. His enormous form, wreathed in psychic energy that distorted the air around him, moved purposefully toward the heart of the fighting. Space Wolves who witnessed his approach reported that he seemed to shift between physical presence and psychic manifestation, sometimes appearing as a giant of crimson flesh and sometimes as a storm of pure energy. Leman Russ, sensing his brother's emergence, disengaged from his current combat and moved to intercept. The two Primarchs met in what had once been Oculum Square, a grand plaza now reduced to a crater-pocked battlefield littered with the bodies of both legions. Their confrontation began not with weapons, but with words, a final attempt at communication before the inevitable violence. What passed between them remains contested in Imperial records. Some accounts suggest that Magnus attempted to explain his actions and the warning he had tried to deliver about Horus. Others indicate that Russ offered his brother a chance to surrender and face the Emperor's judgment rather than death. What is clear is that whatever was said failed to resolve the situation, and the two Primarchs, who had never truly understood one another, resigned themselves to battle. The duel that followed ranks among the most devastating confrontations between Primarchs ever recorded. Magnus, despite his earlier reluctance to fight, unleashed psychic powers that warped reality around the combatants. Russ countered with the primal fury that made him the Emperor's executioner, his enhanced physiology somehow resistant to the worst of Magnus's psychic assaults. The ground beneath them liquefied and reformed with each exchange. The air filled with lightning as Magnus hurled bolts of pure warp energy, while Russ's legendary frost blade carved glittering arcs through the distorted atmosphere. For a time, the battle seemed evenly matched. Then, whether through choice or fatigue, Magnus's psychic defenses faltered. Russ seized the advantage, driving his brother back with a series of devastating blows. The final strike came as Magnus stumbled among the ruins of what had once been a reflection pool. Russ's blade, the sword of Bale Knight, pierced Magnus's chest before being drawn upward with terrible strength, laying open his body from sternum to neck. As Magnus fell to his knees, Russ raised his blade for the killing blow. It was in this moment, with destruction seemingly inevitable, that Magnus made his final choice. Rather than accept death, he called out to the entity that had long courted him, the chaos god Tzinch, master of fate and changer of ways. The psychic cry echoed through the warp, and in an instant, Magnus and his surviving sons vanished from Prospero in a blinding flash of unnatural light. The sudden disappearance of their quarry left the space wolves momentarily disoriented. Russ, denied the finality of his brother's death, ordered the complete destruction of what remained of Tizca. The city that had stood as the pinnacle of human psychic achievement was systematically razed, its libraries burned, its art treasures looted or destroyed, its architectural wonders reduced to rubble. By the time the space wolves departed, Prospero had been transformed from a center of learning and beauty to a smoking graveyard. The Thousand Sons, or those who survived the catastrophe, found themselves transported to a realm of madness and impossibility, the planet of sorcerers within the Eye of Terror. There, Magnus revealed the terrible truth. To save his remaining sons, he had pledged himself to Tzinch, accepting patronage from the very type of warp entity he had once insisted could be safely studied and understood. The Legion that had prided itself on rationality and control now found itself irrevocably bound to chaos. The catastrophe at Prospero represented multiple failures of understanding. The Emperor had failed to clearly communicate the true nature of the warp to Magnus. Magnus had failed to recognize the corrupting influence of his own pride and thirst for knowledge. Leman Russ had failed to see beyond his prejudices and suspicions. These individual failures combined with Horus's manipulations to transform what might have been a measured response to a serious transgression into a near extermination of one of the Emperor's legions. In the aftermath, those Thousand Sons who remained loyal to the Emperor were hunted across the galaxy. Some, like Revul Arvida, would eventually find their way to Terra or other Imperial strongholds, bringing with them fragments of their legion's knowledge and warnings about the true nature of the threat facing humanity. Others would form secretive cabals, attempting to continue their studies while evading both Imperial persecution and the corrupting influence that had claimed their Primarch. For Magnus himself, the breaking of his body on Prospero marked the beginning of a transformation. His physical form, nearly destroyed by Russ, was reshaped by Tzinch's power. His perspective, once defined by scholarly detachment and rationality, twisted toward bitterness and vengeance. The Crimson King, who had sought to be humanity's guide to a psychic future, instead became one of the most dangerous enemies of the Imperium he had helped build, a living embodiment of knowledge corrupted and power misused. The shimmering veil of teleportation energies dissipated, leaving the survivors of the Thousand Sons Legion disoriented and bewildered. No longer surrounded by the burning ruins of Tizca, they found themselves standing upon unfamiliar ground that seemed to shift and breathe beneath their feet. The air around them swirled with unnatural colors that had no names in any human language, while the sky above churned with impossible patterns that strained the mind to comprehend. Magnus the Red, his massive form still bearing the grievous wound inflicted by Leman Russ, stood at the center of his gathered sons. The Crimson King's flesh was already beginning to knit together in ways that defied normal Astartes healing, the torn muscle and shattered bone reforming under the influence of energies that no longer bothered to disguise their true nature. His single eye, once filled with scholarly curiosity, now burned with a combination of pain, rage, and dawning comprehension of the price he had paid for their salvation. "Welcome to our new home," he addressed his legion, his voice carrying across the gathered warriors despite its uncharacteristic weariness. The planet of the sorcerers, Sorshirius. The realm that would become known as Sorshirius existed within the Eye of Terror, that vast wound in reality where the material universe and the warp bled into one another. Unlike the relatively stable planets of real space, this domain constantly reshaped itself according to psychic currents and the whims of its new master, Tzinch. Mountains rose and fell like waves on an ocean. Structures built of impossible geometries dotted the landscape, their architecture shifting when not directly observed. Rivers of liquid that resembled molten metal, but behaved like living tissue, carved new courses through the terrain with each passing moment. The Thousand Sons, numbering barely 1,000 actual survivors despite their legion name, gathered in huddled groups, many still wearing the damaged armor they had fought in on Prospero. Veterans who had maintained perfect composure through centuries of warfare now looked around with undisguised horror and confusion. The most perceptive among them already understood the nature of their salvation and the terrible compromise their Primarch had made to secure it. Ozek Ariman, first captain and chief librarian, approached Magnus with uncharacteristic hesitation, His ornate armor, once a proud display of his status, was now scorched and cracked from the fighting on Prospero. "My lord," he began, "what have we become?" Magnus did not immediately answer. Instead, he gestured toward a nearby rise where, impossibly, fragments of Tizcan architecture had begun to materialize, broken columns and shattered dome sections reassembling themselves into a distorted echo of the structures they had lost. "We have become what we always were," he finally responded, but now without illusions. The first weeks on Sorcerers brought a horrifying revelation that quickly overshadowed even the shock of their new surroundings. The flesh change, that devastating mutation that had once threatened to destroy the Legion before Magnus found a cure, returned with unprecedented virulence. Battle brothers who had shown no symptoms for centuries suddenly found their bodies warping and transforming beyond their control. The mutations manifested with cruel irony, often reflecting the specialized psychic disciplines each warrior had mastered. A Pavoni biomancer might find his flesh becoming hyper-responsive to his thoughts, sprouting additional limbs or sensory organs with each unconscious desire. A Piri pyrokinetic could discover his body temperature rising uncontrollably until his armor melted and fused with his mutating flesh. Raptora telekinetics watched in horror as their own bones restructured themselves according to the same principles they had once used to manipulate external objects. Even those Thousand Sons who had displayed minimal psychic talent were not spared. The taint spread through the Legion indiscriminately, though those with stronger warp connections generally succumbed more rapidly. Warriors who had stood proudly in defense of Prospero mere days before now hid themselves away, ashamed of their transforming bodies and terrified of losing their minds to the uncontrolled mutations. Magnus, still recovering from his near-fatal wound, initially seemed unable or unwilling to address this crisis. He spent long periods in isolation, communing with entities that his sons could sense but not perceive directly. When he did emerge, his own form had begun to change in subtle ways, his proportions becoming slightly more elongated, his single eye sometimes displaying geometric patterns that shifted and rotated within the iris. Ahriman and the surviving captains attempted to manage the crisis, establishing quarantine zones for those most severely affected and researching potential solutions. They drew upon the Legion's vast knowledge of biomancy and warp lore, but found their understanding woefully inadequate for the forces now reshaping their bodies. Traditional techniques that might have stabilized minor mutations in the past proved useless against this accelerated form of the flesh change. The psychological impact of these transformations proved as devastating as the physical effects. The Thousand Sons had defined themselves by their disciplined intellects and carefully controlled psychic abilities. Now, as their bodies betrayed them and their powers fluctuated wildly, many experienced profound identity crises. Warriors who had once debated philosophical nuances with perfect composure now raged at their fate or fell into catatonic despair. This collective trauma accelerated the Legion's transformation from loyal Imperial warriors to bitter exiles. The carefully constructed rationalism that had characterized their approach to the warp began to crumble. In its place grew a desperate pragmatism that prioritized survival over principle. Techniques and rituals that would have been dismissed as dangerous sorcery during their days on Prospero were now embraced as necessary tools against their affliction. Approximately 2 months after their arrival on Sorcerers, Magnus finally emerged from his seclusion with a new purpose. His physical recovery was complete, but the Crimson King who addressed his sons bore little resemblance to the scholar Primarch who had built Tizca's libraries. His armor had been reshaped into elaborate forms featuring avian motifs and complex sigils that hurt the eyes to examine directly. His single eye now contained a vertical pupil that sometimes divided and multiplied when he focused his attention. Most significantly, a pair of great curved horns had emerged from his forehead, giving him a demonic aspect that none could ignore. Magnus announced that the Legion would be restructured around a new understanding of their nature and purpose. The old Fellowship organization, based on Imperial military doctrine, would be abandoned. In its place, the Thousand Sons would organize themselves into cabals, smaller, more flexible groups united by shared psychic specialties and research interests rather than battlefield roles. This reorganization reflected both practical necessity and philosophical shift. With their numbers drastically reduced, maintaining the previous command structure made little sense. More fundamentally, the change represented an explicit rejection of imperial doctrine. No longer would they pretend to be merely an unusually scholarly variant of the Legion's Astartes. They would embrace their nature as masters of the arcane, with organizational structures designed specifically to enhance their psychic capabilities, rather than conform to the Emperor's vision of transhuman warriors. The formation of these cabals proceeded organically, as survivors naturally gravitated toward those whose mutations and abilities mirrored their own. The Corvidi Seers, whose precognitive abilities had grown even more potent in the warp-saturated environment of Sorcerers, formed one of the largest cabals under Ahriman's leadership. The Pavoni Biomancers united under Hather Mott, focusing their efforts on understanding and potentially controlling the physical transformations afflicting the Legion. The Raptora Telekinetics, Piri Pyrokinetics, and other specialist groups similarly consolidated around experienced practitioners of their disciplines. Each cabal established its own sanctum within the emerging landscape of Sorcerers. As the planet responded to the psychic imprint of its new inhabitants, structures began to form that reflected the nature and purposes of each group. The Corvidi domain featured observatories with crystals that displayed possible futures like facets of a jewel. The Pavoni Sanctum included chambers where the fundamental principles of flesh could be studied and manipulated. The Piri established forges where fire and thought became indistinguishable from one another. These physical domains reflected a deeper transformation in how the Thousand Suns approached their psychic practices. The rigorous experimental protocols and careful documentation that had characterized their research on Prospero gave way to more intuitive and ceremonial approaches. Ritual components, incense that enhanced psychic sensitivity, geometric arrangements that channeled warp energies, incantations that focused the mind, became increasingly important in their workings. This shift toward ritualized sorcery accelerated as the Legion discovered that such methods provided more reliable results in the fluid reality of the Eye of Terror. The precise, clinical techniques developed for use in the material universe proved unstable in an environment where reality itself responded to thought and emotion. By contrast, symbolic systems and ceremonial frameworks provided structure that helped control and direct psychic energies in this mutable realm. The adoption of sorceress practices coincided with a fundamental reconsideration of the entities that inhabited the warp. On Prospero, the Thousand Suns had maintained a careful distinction between their scholarly investigation of the immaterium and the superstitious worship of warp beings practiced by primitive cultures. Now, that distinction blurred as they directly experienced the consciousness and agency of these entities. Most significant was their growing relationship with Tzinch, the Changer of Ways, whose patronage had saved them from destruction on Prospero. Magnus never explicitly ordered his sons to worship this entity, but his own increasing communion with Tzinchian powers set an example that many followed. Offerings and invocations that would once have been dismissed as superstitious nonsense became common practice, justified as practical methods for securing assistance rather than as religious devotion. This pragmatic approach to demonic pacts characterized the Legion's fall to chaos. Unlike some who embraced the ruinous powers out of bloodlust or degeneracy, the Thousand Suns rationalized each step of their corruption as necessary adaptation to circumstances. They did not see themselves as having abandoned the pursuit of knowledge that had always defined them, merely as having discarded artificial constraints on how that knowledge could be obtained and applied. The psychological transformation of the Legion from loyal scholars to vengeful sorcerers proceeded alongside these practical and organizational changes. The trauma of Prospero's destruction left wounds deeper than any physical injury. Warriors who had dedicated their existence to preserving human knowledge had watched irreplaceable libraries burn. Scholars who had believed in the imperial truth found themselves betrayed by the very institutions they had helped build. This collective trauma manifested differently across the Legion. Some, like Ahriman, channeled their grief into obsessive quests for knowledge that might undo their losses, Others surrendered to bitterness, their intellectual curiosity transforming into a desire to demonstrate their superiority over those who had rejected them. A significant faction embraced nihilism, concluding that their experiences proved the fundamental meaninglessness of all endeavors. Magnus himself exemplified this psychological transformation. The idealistic scholar who had believed in humanity's psychic evolution became a bitter manipulator who viewed his former aspirations as naive. His relationship with his sons grew increasingly distant and instrumental. Where once he had been an attentive mentor, he now issued cryptic directives and vanished for extended periods to pursue his own inscrutable agenda. The Primarch's physical transformation continued as well, his form becoming increasingly mutable and symbolic rather than strictly biological. Sometimes he appeared almost as he had during the Great Crusade, with only subtle signs of corruption. At other times, he manifested as a being of pure energy barely contained within a humanoid outline. Most disturbing to his sons were the occasions when he seemed to fragment into multiple versions of himself, each representing a different aspect of his fractured psyche. Approximately 1 year after their arrival on Sorcerers, with the reorganization into cabals well established, the Legion faced its first major crisis in exile. The flesh change, which had stabilized somewhat after the initial outbreak, suddenly accelerated again. Dozens of battle brothers transformed completely into mindless, writhing masses of flesh known as chaos spawn, beyond recovery or mercy. Even those who maintained their sanity found the mutations progressing at an alarming rate, with additional eyes, limbs, or more exotic features emerging daily. This crisis brought the Legion's internal tensions to a breaking point. Some cabals advocated complete surrender to the transformations, arguing that they represented evolution rather than corruption. Others sought increasingly desperate sorcerous solutions, conducting dangerous rituals that sometimes accelerated the very changes they sought to prevent. A minority faction even suggested seeking reconciliation with the Imperium, believing that Imperial technologies might offer salvation where their own knowledge had failed. It was in this atmosphere of desperation that Ozek Ahriman conceived the working that would become known as the Rubric. Drawing upon his unparalleled understanding of biomancy, telepathy, and warp manipulation, the chief librarian proposed a Legion-wide ritual that would stabilize the flesh change once and for all. He gathered like-minded sorcerers from various cabals, forming a conclave dedicated to developing and implementing this solution. The exact nature of what Ahriman planned remained closely guarded, known only to his inner circle. What filtered out to the broader Legion was simply that he believed he had found a way to halt the mutations permanently. Given the desperate circumstances, many battle brothers pledged their support without fully understanding what the ritual would entail. Others, sensing the dangerous magnitude of the energies being gathered, voiced concerns that were largely ignored in the atmosphere of crisis. Magnus himself remained enigmatically absent during these developments. Whether he tacitly approved of Ahriman's plans or was simply focused on other matters remains debated among scholars of the Legion's history. What is clear is that he did not intervene to stop the preparations, despite surely being aware of them through his heightened psychic senses. As Ahriman's conclave finalized their preparations, the physical environment of Sorcerers reflected the building's psychic tension. Storms of multicolored lightning lashed the landscape. Structures twisted themselves into new configurations without apparent cause. The very ground became increasingly unstable, sometimes turning transparent to reveal swirling warp energies beneath the surface. The Legion had completed its transformation from loyal Imperial force to servants of chaos. Their organization, practices, and even physical forms now reflected their new allegiance. Yet this transformation had not brought them peace or stability. If anything, their existence had become more precarious and uncertain than ever before. As Ahriman's rubric approached completion, the Thousand Sons stood at another crossroads, one that would determine whether they would retain any connection to their human origins or surrender completely to the mutating influence of the warp. The growing desperation among the survivors of Prospero created fertile ground for radical solutions. Ozek Ahriman, once the first captain and chief librarian of the Thousand Sons, now led the largest cabal of Corvidi seers on Sorcerers. His position afforded him unique insight into the Legion's deteriorating condition. Each day brought new reports of battle brothers succumbing to the flesh change, their bodies warping uncontrollably until they became unrecognizable masses of mutated tissue. Those who maintained their sanity despite severe mutations suffered perhaps the cruelest fate, trapped in grotesque forms while retaining their scholarly minds and memories of former glory. Ahriman's own brother, Oamuzd, had fallen victim to an especially virulent manifestation of the flesh change shortly after their arrival on the planet of sorcerers. The memory of watching his twin's body erupt into a writhing mass of tentacles and secondary mouths haunted Ahriman, driving him to increasingly desperate research. Unlike many of his brothers who had embraced their new existence as servants of Tzinch, Ahriman maintained a clinical detachment in his approach to the warp. He viewed their affliction not as divine punishment or blessing, but as a complex biomantic problem awaiting solution. In the twisted spire that served as his sanctum, Ahriman gathered ancient texts salvaged from Prospero alongside grimoires acquired in their new home. The walls of his study became covered with complex diagrams mapping the progression of the flesh change across different psychic specializations. He meticulously documented how Pavoni biomancers typically develop mutations related to physical enhancement, while Piri cultists often manifested heat-resistant skin that eventually hardened into scales or carapace. These patterns suggested an underlying logic to the mutations. They weren't merely random degeneration, but transformations that perversely reflected each Astartes' psychic specialization. This revelation led Ahriman to a critical insight. The flesh change wasn't simply attacking their physical forms, but was intrinsically linked to their connection with the warp. The stronger a battle brother's psychic abilities, the more pronounced and rapid his mutations became. Conversely, those few thousand suns with minimal psychic talent showed slower progression of symptoms. The cure, Ahriman reasoned, must address not just the physical manifestations, but the underlying warp-flesh interface that defined their existence as psychic Astartes. After months of solitary research, Ahriman began to cautiously share his findings with a select group of senior sorcerers. He first approached Ammon, former captain of the Ninth Fellowship and keeper of the Legion's most esoteric lore. Though Ammon's body had developed a disturbing tendency to shift between solid and semi-transparent states, his mind remained sharp. Together, they reviewed Ahriman's research, with Ammon contributing crucial insights from pre-imperial Prosperine traditions that had examined the relationship between physical form and psychic essence. Next came Hathor Mott of the Pavoni, once renowned for his physical perfection, but now sporting crystalline growths that refracted light in impossible patterns. His expertise in biomancy proved invaluable as they developed theoretical models for stabilizing the physical form against warp influence. The Cabal grew to include Phosis Tikar, whose telekinetic mastery had survived even as his body developed an unsettling tendency to phase through solid matter, and Enku Anin, whose mutations had gifted him with precognitive visions, but at the cost of experiencing time non-linearly. This inner circle expanded methodically to include representatives from each of the Legion's major psychic disciplines. Each brought unique perspectives and specialized knowledge. The Athenians contributed techniques for mental fortification, the Raptora offered insights into creating stable energy fields, and the Piri provided expertise in channeling and controlling volatile warp energies. Even members of the more obscure cults were consulted for their specialized knowledge. The Kalapoja's understanding of flesh shaping and the Saranuno's mastery of illusion both proved unexpectedly relevant to Ahriman's developing theory. The Cabal established a hidden workshop deep within Sorcerers, where they could conduct their research away from the attention of both their fellow Thousand Sons and the ever-watching gaze of their new patron. The chamber, carved from living crystal that absorbed ambient warp energy, contained concentric circles of silver inlaid with complex geometric patterns. These designs weren't merely decorative, but served as psychic circuit boards, channeling and directing energies during experimental workings. As word of Ahriman's project spread through the Legion, reactions varied dramatically. Many battle brothers, desperate for any solution, pledged their support without questioning the details. Others, particularly those who had more fully embraced their new existence as servants of Tzinch, viewed the effort with suspicion. They argued that the mutations represented evolution rather than corruption, a perspective Ahriman privately considered rationalization of their suffering rather than genuine acceptance. Most concerning was Magnus' continued absence. The Crimson King had grown increasingly remote, spending long periods communing with entities that even his sons could not perceive. When he did appear among them, his form shifted constantly, sometimes appearing almost as he had during the Great Crusade, other times manifesting as a being of pure energy barely contained within a vaguely humanoid outline. His guidance, once the cornerstone of Legion doctrine, had become cryptic and inconsistent. Without their Primarch's clear direction, the Legion fractured into competing philosophical camps. Some embraced their transformation into sorcerers, adopting increasingly elaborate rituals and pacts with warp entities. Others attempted to maintain some connection to their scholarly past, approaching their new circumstances with experimental rigor, despite the challenges of operating in a realm where reality itself responded to thought and emotion. Ahriman's cabal navigated this divided landscape carefully, drawing support from both factions by presenting their work in different terms depending on the audience. To traditionalists, they described the rubric as a scientific solution based on biomantic principles. To those who had embraced sorcery, they emphasized the ritual components and the unprecedented scale of warp manipulation involved. This strategic ambiguity allowed them to gather resources and support while avoiding direct confrontation with either camp. The development of what would become the rubric of Ahriman proceeded through several distinct phases. Initial experiments focused on individual battle brothers, attempting to stabilize their mutations through targeted biomantic interventions. These efforts proved temporarily successful, but inevitably failed as the warp's influence reasserted itself. The Cabal realized that piecemeal solutions could not counter a problem that affected the Legion at its fundamental level. They needed a working that would address the Thousand Suns as a unified psychic entity. This conceptual breakthrough led to increasingly ambitious experiments. The Cabal developed prototype rituals that linked small groups of volunteers, creating shared psychic fields that distributed the pressure of warp influence across multiple subjects. These tests showed promise but revealed a troubling pattern. When the rituals concluded, those with stronger psychic abilities showed marked improvement, while those with lesser talents often suffered accelerated mutation. Something in the process was drawing energy from the weaker subjects to stabilize the stronger. Rather than abandoning this approach, Ahriman incorporated this dynamic into his developing theory. If the flesh change affected each battle brother according to his psychic potential, perhaps the solution wasn't to fight this pattern, but to extend it to its logical conclusion. The strongest psychers could be preserved in their current state, while the weakest, those already most vulnerable to mutation, could serve as anchors, their psychic essence reconfigured to resist change entirely. The ethical implications of this approach sparked intense debate within the Cabal. Some argued that sacrificing the psychic potential of their weaker brothers was too high a price, regardless of the benefits. Others countered that with the Legion facing extinction, partial salvation was better than none. Ahriman himself maintained that the process would stabilize rather than harm the affected battle brothers, though privately his confidence in this outcome wavered as their research progressed. Despite these concerns, the devastating progression of the flesh change throughout the Legion forced their hand. Battle brothers were being lost daily, either transforming completely into mindless spawn or taking their own lives rather than endure further degradation. The Cabal's work took on increased urgency, with experimental protocols accelerated and safety margins narrowed in the race against time. After nearly a year of development, Ahriman determined that the rubric was ready for implementation. The final design incorporated elements from all major psychic disciplines practiced by the Thousand Suns. At its core lay a modified version of the enumerations, the mental techniques once used to access different levels of psychic ability, reconfigured to create a stable matrix that would contain and regulate each battle brother's connection to the warp. The physical components of the ritual reflected this complexity. The Cabal constructed a massive chamber at the heart of Sorcerers, its dimensions conforming to mathematical ratios derived from their research. Channels carved into the floor formed 9 interlocking nonagons, each corresponding to one of the Legion's primary disciplines. At critical intersection points, they placed crystalline focusing devices salvaged from Prospero, now infused with energies unique to their new home in the Eye of Terror. The timing of the ritual was determined through extensive divination, identifying a period when the local warp currents would be relatively stable, and the planet's position within the eye would maximize their connection to specific Empyrean domains. Preparations consumed the Legion's resources and attention, with even those skeptical of the project contributing materials or expertise. Whatever their philosophical differences, the shared threat of extinction united the 1,000 suns in this final effort to preserve their existence. On the appointed day, Ahriman summoned the Legion to gather. Battle brothers traveled from across Sorcerers, some barely recognizable as the proud warriors who had once defended Prospero. They arranged themselves according to their psychic specialties, forming living representations of the sigils inscribed upon the chamber floor. The strongest sorcerers, including Ahriman's inner cabal, took positions at the critical nodes of the pattern, while those with lesser abilities filled the connecting lines and curves. As the ritual began, Ahriman led the assembled 1,000 suns through modified versions of their familiar enumerations. The disciplined mental exercises, once used to access different levels of psychic ability, now served to synchronize the Legion's collective consciousness. As thousands of transhuman minds aligned in unprecedented harmony, the air within the chamber became charged with potential, colors shifting through spectra visible and invisible as reality thinned. The first phase proceeded exactly as planned. Warp energy flowed through the assembled Legion in carefully managed currents, following pathways defined by both the physical arrangement of participants and the psychic structures they collectively generated. Those with the strongest abilities served as conduits, channeling and refining the raw power drawn from the surrounding immaterium. The weaker psychers functioned as stabilizing elements, their more limited connections to the warp providing fixed points around which the greater energies could safely orbit. Then came the moment of transformation. Ahriman initiated the final sequence, a complex telepathic command that cascaded through the assembled Legion, triggering the prepared psychic matrices within each battle brother. The energy that had been gathering and circulating now flowed inward, penetrating to the core of each 1,000 suns being where Gene's seed, flesh, and warp essence intermingled. What happened next exceeded even Ahriman's most extreme predictions. The ritual's power amplified beyond all calculated parameters, drawing energy not just from the assembled sorcerers but from the fabric of Sorcerers itself. The carefully managed flows became a torrent, a psychic tsunami that overwhelmed the ritual's safeguards and swept through the Legion with catastrophic force. For those with the strongest psychic abilities, Ahriman himself, his inner cabal, and perhaps 100 others of similar potential, the experience was transcendent. The flesh change that had threatened them halted instantly, their mutation stabilizing in forms that, while not fully human, remained functional and controlled. Their connection to the warp clarified and strengthened, granting them unprecedented psychic capabilities as the ritual's energy reshaped their very essence according to their specialized disciplines. But for the vast majority of the Legion, those with lesser psychic talents, the outcome was far different. The overwhelming energies of the rubric burned through their physical forms, reducing flesh, blood, and organs to fine dust while leaving their armor intact. Their consciousness, rather than being extinguished, became trapped within these hollow shells, aware but unable to interact with the physical world except through the most limited means. They became living statues, their armor animated by the trapped essence of what had once been proud space marines. As the energies of the ritual finally dissipated, Ahriman stood amid the results of his work. Around him, his most powerful brothers were examining their stabilized forms with wonder and relief. But these fortunate few were vastly outnumbered by the silent, immobile figures that now populated the chamber, the dust-filled armor of their less gifted brothers, standing in perfect formation where living warriors had been moments before. The horror of what he had done crashed over Ahriman in waves. The rubric had succeeded in halting the flesh change, but at a cost he had never anticipated. Instead of saving the Legion, he had transformed it into something barely recognizable, a small cadre of immensely powerful sorcerers commanding an army of animated husks. The brothers he had sought to save were neither fully alive nor truly dead, existing in a twilight state that offered neither peace nor true continuation. Magnus the Red, who had been conspicuously absent during the ritual preparations, now manifested in the chamber's center. His form had stabilized into a new configuration, a towering figure with crimson skin, ornate armor fused with his flesh, and great curved horns extending from his forehead. His single eye blazed with fury as he beheld what remained of his legion. The Primarch's rage was terrible to behold. The chamber shook with his wrath as he denounced Ahriman's arrogance in attempting what even his own considerable powers had failed to accomplish. The rubric, he declared, had not saved the 1,000 Suns, but transformed them into a mockery of their former selves. Where once stood a legion of scholar warriors, now remained only dust and echoes, preserved in a state that Magnus considered worse than extinction. Ahriman attempted to defend his actions, pointing to those who had been successfully stabilized and arguing that partial salvation was preferable to complete destruction. His arguments fell on deaf ears. Magnus pronounced judgment. Ahriman and his inner cabal would be banished from Sorcerers, forbidden from rejoining their brothers. They would wander the galaxy as exiles, bearing witness to the consequences of their hubris. Before departing into exile, Ahriman made one final discovery that would shape his future course. Through careful psychic examination, he determined that the rubric key, as the dust-filled warriors came to be known, retained some fragment of their former consciousness. Though unable to act independently, they responded to the commands of their sorcerer brothers, particularly those who had known them in life. More importantly, Ahriman detected patterns in their psychic residue, suggesting that their condition might not be permanent, that with sufficient understanding and power, the process might someday be reversed. This glimmer of hope became Ahriman's obsession as he departed Sorcerers with his fellow exiles. The rubric that bore his name had failed in its intended purpose, but perhaps its effects could be refined, improved, or even undone entirely. The quest to perfect his greatest failure would drive him across the galaxy and through the millennia, shaping the destiny of the fragmented Legion far beyond the catastrophe of its initial casting. The aftermath of the rubric left the 1,000 Suns fundamentally altered. Where once stood a legion of scholar warriors united in their pursuit of knowledge, now remained a fractured hierarchy of sorcerers commanding legions of dust-filled automata. This transformation extended beyond mere physical change. It represented a complete metamorphosis of the Legion's structure, philosophy, and relationship with the warp. The 9 original cults that had formed the organizational backbone of the 1,000 Suns underwent dramatic evolution in the wake of Ahriman's exile. No longer academic divisions focused on specialized fields of psychic study, they became increasingly esoteric cabals dedicated to particular aspects of sorceress mastery. Their transformation reflected the Legion's broader shift from imperial scholars to servants of Tzinch, with each cult developing ritualistic practices and symbolic associations that would have been unthinkable during their days on Prospero. The Corvidi, once focused on divination and strategic foresight, evolved into masters of fate manipulation. Their original discipline had emphasized passive observation of probable futures, using these insights to guide tactical decisions. In their transformed state, Corvidi sorcerers actively intervened in causality itself, weaving complex spells that could subtly alter the likelihood of specific outcomes or create branching paths of possibility. Their rituals incorporated avian symbolism with increasing literalness. Many Corvidi sorcerers developed mutations that gave them raven-like features, from feathered crests to hollow bones that enhanced their levitation abilities. The Piri underwent perhaps the most visually dramatic transformation. Their original focus on pyrokinesis expanded into mastery of transmutation in all its forms. Fire remained their primary medium, but they now understood it as the fundamental agent of change rather than simply a destructive force. Piri sorcerers developed the ability to transmute matter on contact, turning flesh to crystal or metal to living tissue. Their physical forms reflected this affinity, with many developing skin that shifted between different states, organic tissue that could harden into metallic scales or flow like liquid when necessary. Their eyes universally transformed to contain dancing flames that reflected their inner fire. The Raptora, specialists in telekinesis, became architects of reality itself. Their ability to manipulate physical objects expanded to include the fabric of space-time, allowing them to create localized distortions where physical laws operated differently. A Raptora sorcerer might create a pocket where gravity reversed, time flowed backward, or multiple objects could occupy the same space simultaneously. Their mutations often manifested as additional limbs of pure energy that existed partially in the material realm and partially in the warp, allowing them to interact with both simultaneously. The Athenian cult, focused on telepathy, evolved into masters of consciousness manipulation. Where they had once read thoughts or communicated mind to mind, they now possessed the ability to fragment and reconstruct the very structure of sentience. Athenian sorcerers could extract memories as tangible crystalline objects, implant false personalities that would gradually overwrite the original, or merge multiple consciousnesses into composite entities. Their physical mutations typically affected their cranial structure, with many developing transparent portions of skull through which their physically altered brains could be seen pulsing with psychic energy. The Pavoni, originally biomancers focused on enhancing physical perfection, became sculptors of flesh who viewed bodies as malleable art forms rather than fixed structures. Their powers expanded beyond self-enhancement to include the ability to reshape others, often without consent. A Pavoni sorcerer could reconfigure an enemy's internal organs into non-functional arrangements or transform loyal servants into living weapons optimized for specific tasks. Their own forms became canvases for their art, with many developing chameleon-like abilities to shift their appearance at will or sprouting decorative growths that formed patterns of disturbing beauty. The lesser cults underwent similarly profound transformations. The Kalapoja, once focused on animal communion, developed the ability to extract and transfer bestial essences between creatures or implant them into humanoid hosts. The Ethegis, specialists in warding, became masters of dimensional imprisonment, creating pocket realms where they could trap enemies or store dangerous artifacts. The Saranunos expanded their illusory talents to include the ability to give temporary physical form to imagined constructs, blurring the line between illusion and reality. This transformation of the cults reflected a broader philosophical shift within the Legion. On Prospero, the different psychic disciplines had been approached as academic specialties, different but equally valid approaches to understanding the warp through scientific principles. In their new existence as servants of Tzinch, these disciplines became competing paths to power, each claiming superior understanding of their patron's mysteries. What had once been collegial rivalry between scholarly traditions devolved into factional conflict between sorceress cabals, each seeking to curry favor with both Magnus and their new patron god. The hierarchy that emerged from this transformation bore little resemblance to the meritocratic structure of the pre-heresy legion. Magnus the Red, now a demon Primarch, stood at the apex not as a scholar general, but as a living conduit of Tzinch's power. His authority stemmed not from imperial sanction, but from his status as his patron's most favored servant. The Crimson King's physical form had stabilized into a new configuration that symbolized this changed status, a towering figure with crimson skin, ornate armor fused with his flesh, and great curved horns extending from his forehead. His single eye now contained geometric patterns that shifted and rotated, reflecting the constant calculation of plots within plots that occupied his transformed mind. Below Magnus stood the exalted sorcerers, those who had possessed sufficient psychic strength to retain their independence and consciousness after the rubric. No longer bound by the rigid command structure of a space marine legion, these powerful individuals established their own domains within the planet of sorcerers. Each commanded a personal thrallband composed of rubric marines drawn from their former brothers, aspiring sorcerers who sought their patronage, and various warp entities bound to their service. The relationship between these exalted sorcerers combined elements of feudal hierarchy, academic mentorship, and religious cult. A powerful sorcerer might claim territory on Sorciarius, establishing a fortress temple where he pursued his particular obsessions, while lesser practitioners pledged service in exchange for knowledge and protection. These arrangements remained fluid, with alliances forming and dissolving according to the inscrutable plans of both the sorcerers themselves and their patron god. The exalted sorcerers developed distinct specializations based on their pre-rubric affiliations, but these now extended far beyond the original cult disciplines. Some focused on demon binding, developing complex formulae for summoning and controlling entities from the deeper warp. Others specialized in artifact creation, forging weapons and talismans that incorporated crystallized warp energy. Still others devoted themselves to flesh crafting, creating homunculi and chimeric servants from raw biological material. This specialization extended to their physical appearance as well. Free from the constraints of purely human form, the exalted sorcerers embraced mutations that enhanced their particular abilities. A master of demon binding might develop additional eyes that could perceive into multiple dimensions simultaneously. A specialist in artifact creation could grow metallic components that interfaced directly with his creations. The diversity of forms reflected both the infinite mutability of Tzeentch's gifts and the individual preferences of sorcerers who now viewed their bodies as extensions of their will rather than fixed biological entities. Below the exalted sorcerers in the new hierarchy stood the aspiring sorcerers, those with psychic potential who had joined the Legion after the rubric, or who had possessed insufficient power to achieve exalted status during the ritual. These individuals occupied a precarious position, constantly striving to prove their worth while navigating the complex politics of their superiors. An aspiring sorcerer typically commanded a small contingent of rubric marines, using these dust-filled automata as both bodyguards and symbols of status. The advancement path for these aspirants differed dramatically from the structured promotion system of the pre-heresy Legion. Rather than progressing through clearly defined ranks based on service time and achievement, they sought to increase their standing through a combination of sorceress accomplishment, political maneuvering, and direct patronage from more powerful entities. An ambitious aspiring sorcerer might attempt to discover a new ritual that would earn recognition from an exalted sorcerer, or he might bind a particularly powerful demon to gain leverage in Legion politics. This competitive environment fostered innovation, but also encouraged dangerous risk-taking. Many aspiring sorcerers met their end attempting workings beyond their capabilities or falling victim to the machinations of rivals. Those who survived this crucible emerged with enhanced powers and deeper corruption, their forms and minds increasingly aligned with Tzeentchian principles of constant change and labyrinthine plotting. At the foundation of this new hierarchy stood the rubric Marines, the dust-filled armor of battle brothers, whose physical forms had been consumed by Ahriman's ritual. These silent automata retained fragments of their former consciousness, but lacked true independence or will. They responded primarily to the commands of sorcerers who had known them in life, particularly those from their original fellowship or cult. This connection allowed for limited recall of their former tactical abilities, with rubric Marines displaying fighting styles and preferences that echoed their pre-transformation specializations. The development of techniques to control and direct these dust-filled warriors became a specialized field of study within the transformed Legion. Certain sorcerers discovered methods to imprint temporary purpose-specific directives into the residual consciousness of rubric Marines, allowing for more complex tactical coordination than simple direct commands. Others developed rituals that could temporarily awaken greater portions of the trapped mind, briefly restoring a semblance of the original personality for specific purposes before it faded back into dormancy. The relationship between the sorcerers and their rubric thralls reflected the transformed Legion's broader ethical shift. Where the pre-heresy Thousand Sons had valued knowledge for its potential to elevate humanity, their post-rubric incarnation increasingly viewed all things, including their former brothers, as resources to be utilized in the pursuit of personal power and the advancement of Tzeentch's incomprehensible schemes. This philosophical transformation extended to the Legion's relationship with warp entities. On Prospero, the Thousand Sons had maintained a careful distinction between their scholarly investigation of the immaterium and the superstitious worship of warp beings practiced by primitive cultures. They had employed tutelaries, minor warp entities bound through complex psychic techniques, but viewed these as tools rather than allies or masters. In their new existence, this clinical detachment gave way to increasingly direct collaboration with demonic forces. The summoning and binding of Tzeentchian entities became a cornerstone of the Legion's sorceress practices. These creatures ranged from relatively minor familiars that served as spies and messengers to powerful demons capable of devastating battlefield effects. The most accomplished sorcerers could call forth Lords of Change, the greater demons of Tzeentch, though such entities never truly served and required careful management to prevent them from pursuing their own agendas at their summoner's expense. Among the most commonly summoned entities were the Tzongers, avian beastmen whose physical forms reflected Tzeentch's aesthetic preferences. These creatures existed at the intersection of humanity and demonkind, possessing physical bodies that could operate in the material realm without the constant expenditure of energy required by pure demons. The Thousand Sons developed specialized rituals to create or summon these beings, employing them as shock troops, scouts, and ritual assistants. The creation of Tzongers exemplified the transformed Legion's approach to warfare. Rather than relying solely on the direct application of force, they developed techniques to reshape the battlefield environment itself. Sorcerers would prepare areas for conflict through elaborate rituals that thin the barriers between dimensions, allowing for easier manifestation of warp entities and enhancing their own psychic abilities. These preparations often included the placement of arcane markers, the sacrifice of suitable vessels, and the establishment of sorceress circles that would serve as anchor points for more complex workings during battle. This approach extended to the development of specialized warpcraft for battlefield application. The Thousand Sons created techniques for opening targeted breaches in reality that could disgorge flamers of Tzeentch demonic entities that projected warpfire capable of burning both body and soul. They perfected methods for summoning screamers, ray-like entities that could slice through reality itself, bypassing physical armor to attack the essence within. Most terrifying were the rituals that could temporarily transform sections of the battlefield into extensions of the planet of sorcerers, subjecting all within to the fluid physics and mutating energies of that demon world. The Legion's relationship with the greater forces of Tzeentch within the Great Game of Chaos reflected their scholarly origins despite their corruption. Where the World Eaters gave themselves completely to Khorne's bloodlust, and the Death Guard embraced Nurgle's cycle of decay and rebirth, the Thousand Sons maintained a certain intellectual distance from their patron. They served Tzeentch's interests, but continued to pursue their own agendas, viewing their relationship as a partnership of mutual benefit rather than one of master and slave. This relative independence came with significant risk. Tzeentch, the embodiment of change and manipulation, constantly tested his servants through elaborate schemes designed to challenge their intellect and loyalty. Thousand Sons sorcerers found themselves caught in labyrinthine plots where success might lead to reward or merely to a more complex challenge. Failure typically resulted in transformation to a chaos spawn or relegation to a lesser position within the Legion hierarchy. The planet of sorcerers itself evolved to reflect this complex relationship between the Legion and their patron. The landscape constantly reshaped itself according to psychic currents and the relative standing of different factions within Tzeentch's favor. A sorcerer whose star was rising might find his tower growing taller overnight, while one who had failed in some crucial task could wake to find his sanctum sinking into the ever-shifting ground. These physical manifestations of favor and disfavor created a visible representation of the Legion's internal politics. Within this transformed environment, the Thousand Sons developed increasingly esoteric approaches to warfare that reflected their new nature. No longer bound by the Codex Astartes or imperial military doctrine, they organized themselves into thrall bands, flexible formations built around a central sorcerer, and his closest disciples. These groups typically included a core of rubric marines, specialized summoned entities, and mortal cultists who provided support services and served as potential vessels for possession. The tactical approach of these thrallbands emphasized quality over quantity and surgical precision over overwhelming force. A typical operation might begin with extensive divination to identify critical vulnerabilities, followed by targeted teleportation strikes against key objectives. Sorcerers would deploy reality warping powers to create advantageous battlefield conditions, while their rubric marines provided methodical fire support. Summoned entities would be employed for specific tactical purposes: flamers to clear entrenched positions, screamers to eliminate heavily armored threats, T-zongers to secure objectives. This transformation of the Thousand Sons from Loyalist Legion to servants of T-Zint represented one of the most profound changes undergone by any of the traitor forces. Where some fell to chaos through bloodlust or despair, the Sons of Magnus completed their damnation through the very intellectual curiosity that had once been their greatest strength. Their story served as a cautionary tale of how the pursuit of knowledge without ethical constraints could lead even the most brilliant minds into darkness, a lesson the Imperium would enshrine in its prohibitions against unsanctioned psychic research for millennia to come. The Thousand Sons' participation in the Long War has never followed conventional patterns of conquest. While other traitor legions measured success through worlds claimed or enemies slaughtered, the Sons of Magnus pursued objectives comprehensible only to those versed in arcane lore. Their campaigns across the millennia have been surgical operations aimed at acquiring knowledge, artifacts, and access to psychic nexus points, rather than establishing territorial dominion. The Legion's first major post-heresy action came during Abaddon's First Black Crusade in the early 31st millennium. While the Despoiler's primary forces assaulted the Cadian Gate, several Thousand Sons thrallbands struck at seemingly inconsequential targets throughout the Gothic sector. Imperial defenders were baffled when powerful sorcerer lords bypassed strategic military installations to raid forgotten archives and abandoned research stations. Only decades later did inquisitorial investigators realize these raids had systematically gathered fragments of an ancient pre-imperial star chart, mapping warp currents and psychic nodes across the segmentum. This pattern of targeted acquisition continued through subsequent Black Crusades. During the Third Black Crusade, while Abaddon's forces were occupied with the Adeptus Mechanicus fortress world of Hydra Cordatus, the Thousand Sons mounted a parallel campaign against the isolated world of Xenophon. Imperial records of this incursion remain heavily redacted, but surviving accounts describe Thousand Sons sorcerers breaching the planetary defense grid with unprecedented ease, making directly for a specific archaeological site that had been under Mechanicus supervision. Whatever they recovered there necessitated the Inquisition placing the entire Xenophon system under permanent quarantine. The Sixth Black Crusade saw more overt cooperation between the Thousand Sons and Abaddon's forces. Exalted sorcerer Mordant Hex provided crucial intelligence on Imperial fleet movements that allowed the Despoiler's forces to ambush and destroy the relic fleet of Admiral Ravensburg. In exchange, Abaddon granted the Thousand Sons exclusive access to the Maiden Worlds along the Eldar Maiden Path, where they conducted complex rituals at ancient Eldar psychic waypoints. These workings created persistent warp anomalies that continue to disrupt Imperial navigation in those sectors millennia later. By the Ninth Black Crusade, the Thousand Sons had refined their approach further. Rather than committing large forces, they deployed small teams of elite sorcerers embedded within larger chaos forces. These specialists focused on opening temporary warp rifts behind Imperial lines, allowing for precision strikes against specific targets. On Corellia, a single exalted sorcerer and 9 rubric marines penetrated the supposedly impregnable Librarium Invictus, extracting thousands of forbidden texts while leaving no trace of their methods of entry or exit. The 13th Black Crusade marked a significant escalation in Thousand Sons' involvement. With the fall of Cadia and the formation of the Great Rift, Magnus himself led substantial Legion forces in a campaign against the Fenris system. This attack, coinciding with Abaddon's main thrust, forced the Imperium to divide its defensive resources at a critical moment. The Crimson King's true objective, however, was not the destruction of his ancient enemies, but the acquisition of artifacts from the Fenrisian underworld that contained fragments of the Emperor's original psychic workings from the creation of the Primarchs. Beyond their participation in Black Crusades, the Thousand Sons have pursued independent campaigns structured around arcane timetables and esoteric objectives. The Chrono War of the Calidus Belt saw Thousand Sons forces appearing simultaneously across 7 star systems, each attack precisely timed to correspond with specific astronomical alignments. Imperial defenders found themselves outmaneuvered not through superior tactics, but because their enemies had calculated exactly when and where defensive resources would be thinnest. The pursuit of arcane artifacts has driven many of the Legion's most significant operations. The Thousand Sons approach such acquisitions with methodical precision that reflects their scholarly origins. Before attempting to secure a target, they typically spend years or even decades gathering intelligence, analyzing defensive measures, and preparing specialized countermeasures. This patient approach has allowed them to acquire items of immense power that eluded other chaos forces. The raid on Apollonia exemplifies this methodology. For nearly a century, the Thousand Sons infiltrated the upper echelons of the planet's nobility through possessed agents and subtle mind control. When they finally struck, it was during a planetary alignment that occurs once every 3,000 years, temporarily weakening the psychic wards protecting the vault of Tzenter. The entire operation lasted less than 6 hours, with minimal casualties on either side. The Thousand Sons departed with their prize, a pre-imperial device capable of translating xeno-psychic languages, before most of the population even realized they were under attack. Even more ambitious was the millennia-long operation to secure the Oculus of Tzunla, this crystalline artifact, capable of viewing events across vast distances of both space and time, had been fragmented into 9 shards and scattered across the Imperium following the Horus Heresy. The Thousand Sons methodically recovered each fragment, with operations spanning from the 32nd millennium to the 41st. The final shard was extracted from the depths of an Adeptus Mechanicus vault on Mars itself, in an operation so subtle that the theft wasn't discovered for over 3 decades. The Legion's pursuit of knowledge extends beyond physical artifacts to include access to psychic nexus points, locations where the barrier between real space and the warp is naturally thin. Such sites offer unique opportunities for complex sorceress workings that would be impossible elsewhere. The Thousand Sons have mapped these locations with painstaking accuracy, often establishing permanent outposts to monitor and exploit them. The Nexus of Val's Anvil became the site of a protracted conflict when the Thousand Sons attempted to establish control over this powerful warp-real interface point. Unlike their typically subtle operations, this campaign involved substantial forces, including multiple thrall bands supported by demon engines and Tzongr auxiliaries. The Grey Knights responded in force, resulting in a 9-year conflict that devastated the surrounding sector. The Thousand Sons eventually withdrew, but not before completing a complex ritual that fundamentally altered the Nexus, making it unsuitable for Imperial use while creating a permanent connection to the planet of sorcerers. Similarly, the Thousand Sons' interest in the Catathuran Rift puzzled Imperial strategists until Ordo Malleus investigations revealed the region contained a unique phenomenon, a self-sustaining psychic echo of a civilization that had destroyed itself through uncontrolled psychic awakening. By studying this echo, the Thousand Sons sought to understand the process of species-wide psychic ascension, knowledge that aligned with Magnus' pre-heresy obsession with guiding humanity's psychic evolution. The vendetta between the Thousand Sons and the Space Wolves has burned undiminished across 10 millennia, evolving from the mutual suspicion of the Great Crusade into an enduring hatred that defines both legions. This conflict transcends mere military rivalry. It represents a fundamental philosophical opposition between two approaches to power: the scholarly esotericism of the Thousand Sons against the primal spiritualism of the Space Wolves. The first major post-heresy confrontation occurred during the Battle of the Fang in the 32nd millennium. Magnus led a substantial force in a direct assault on the Space Wolves' fortress monastery, an uncharacteristically frontal approach that reflected the personal nature of his vendetta. While imperial histories record this as a failed attempt to destroy the Sons of Rus, Magnus' actual objectives were more nuanced. The attack allowed specialized Thousand Sons operatives to access the deepest vaults of the Fang, where they recovered gene seed samples and ancient texts describing the Space Wolves' unique relationship with the Warp, knowledge that would inform Legion strategies for millennia to come. The Wolves, for their part, have relentlessly hunted Thousand Sons forces whenever they appear in real space. The 13th Great Company, lost in the Warp since the Heresy, specialized in tracking and eliminating Thousand Sons operations. Their understanding of warp travel allowed them to intercept Thousand Sons forces at critical moments, disrupting carefully planned operations and forcing the sorcerers to adapt their methodologies to account for these unpredictable adversaries. This ongoing conflict reached new intensity following the siege of the Fenris system during the 13th Black Crusade. Magnus personally led a massive assault that devastated multiple worlds in the system and corrupted portions of Fenris itself with warp energies. The Crimson King's forces penetrated the Fang deeper than any previous attack, accessing ancient chambers containing secrets from the founding of the Space Wolves Legion. Though ultimately repelled by the combined efforts of the Space Wolves and their successors, the Thousand Sons withdrew with crucial intelligence on the metaphysical underpinnings of Fenrisian runic magic. The aftermath of this campaign saw increased Thousand Sons activity across sectors adjacent to Fenris. Thrallban's targeted worlds with historical connections to the Space Wolves, systematically corrupting or destroying sites sacred to the Sons of Rus. On Gnosis Prime, Thousand Sons sorcerers defiled an ancient temple where Leman Russ had reportedly received a vision during the Great Crusade. The psychic backlash from this desecration temporarily disrupted the Space Wolves' runic divination abilities across 3 sectors. Not all conflicts between these ancient enemies have been direct confrontations. The Thousand Sons excel at subtle corruption, and they have repeatedly attempted to taint the Space Wolves' gene seed through sorcerous means. The affliction of the Wolfen, periodic outbreaks of accelerated mutation among Space Wolf aspirants, has been linked to Thousand Sons rituals designed to exploit the inherent instability in the Fenrisian gene seed. These biological attacks have forced the Space Wolves to commit significant resources to protecting their recruitment processes and purifying their gene stocks. The strategic approach of the Thousand Sons to the Long War reflects their unique nature as a legion dominated by sorcerers rather than conventional warriors. While other traitor legions measure success through territory controlled or enemies slain, the Sons of Magnus pursue a more complex agenda centered on the accumulation of knowledge and psychic power. Their campaigns rarely aim to hold ground or establish permanent footholds in real space. Instead, they focus on surgical strikes to acquire specific targets before withdrawing to the planet of sorcerers. This methodology manifests in their approach to warfare. Thousand Sons forces typically deploy in relatively small but highly specialized formations built around specific sorceress capabilities. A typical Thrallband might include only a handful of exalted sorcerers supported by several squads of rubric marines, with Tzonger auxiliaries providing screening and close combat capabilities. These compact forces can be rapidly teleported to their objectives through warp rifts, allowing for operations deep behind enemy lines without the logistical challenges faced by larger armies. The raid on Savivan exemplifies this approach. 3,000 Sons Thrallbands struck simultaneously at different locations across the heavily fortified Shrine world, while Imperial defenders mobilized to counter what they perceived as the main threat, an assault on the planetary governor's palace. The actual objective was being secured by a small team led by exalted sorcerer Ignis. This group penetrated the ancient Librarium Hereticus, bypassing layers of both physical and psychic security through a combination of precise teleportation and targeted mind control of key personnel. They extracted hundreds of pre-Imperial texts before vanishing back through a warp portal, leaving Imperial forces to battle summoned demons that served merely as a diversion. The Thousand Sons' preference for knowledge over territory extends to their treatment of conquered populations. Unlike the World Eaters who slaughter indiscriminately, or the Emperor's children who subjugate for pleasure, the Thousand Sons typically view mortal humans as research subjects or potential vessels. Planetary populations that fall under their control often find themselves subjected to mass psychic screening, with those showing particular potential culled for use in rituals or possession. The remainder may be left largely intact, though subtly influenced to produce cultural and architectural patterns that create favorable conditions for future sorceress workings. This approach was evident during the temporary occupation of Helix Secundus. Rather than destroying the planet's infrastructure, Thousand Sons forces reorganized settlement patterns into precise geometric configurations that created a planet-wide sorceress circuit. Buildings were modified with specific architectural elements that resonated with warp energies, while the population was subjected to subtle mimetic conditioning that altered their collective psychic signature. When Imperial forces finally reclaimed the world 3 decades later, they discovered that the entire planet had been transformed into a psychic amplifier that continued to broadcast signals into the warp long after the Thousand Sons had departed. The Legion's campaign strategies often operate on multiple timescales simultaneously. While individual operations may be completed in hours or days, these typically form part of larger patterns designed to unfold over centuries or millennia. The seemingly random target selection that baffles Imperial strategists often follows complex arcane, formulae comprehensible only to the Thousand Sons' senior leadership. A particular artifact might be sought not for its immediate utility, but because its acquisition is a necessary precursor to a ritual planned for completion thousands of years in the future. This long-term perspective gives the Thousand Sons a strategic patience unmatched by other Chaos forces. They willingly abandon operations that encounter unexpected resistance, preferring to withdraw and recalculate rather than commit to potentially Pyrrhic victories. This can create the illusion of Imperial success, when in reality the Thousand Sons have simply deferred their objectives to a more favorable timeframe. Many apparent defeats have later been revealed as calculated withdrawals that served some greater purpose in Magnus' inscrutable schemes. As the 42nd millennium dawns and the galaxy is split by the Great Rift, the Thousand Sons have entered a new phase of activity. The thinning of the barriers between real space and the warp has created unprecedented opportunities for their sorceress operations. Psychic nexus points that were previously difficult to access now lie exposed, while the general weakening of reality's fabric allows for more ambitious workings than were previously possible. The Legion has responded with increased aggression, launching simultaneous operations across multiple sectors with a coordination that suggests some greater design has entered its final phase. The translation of the planet of sorcerers into real space marked a pivotal moment in the Thousand Sons' long exile. For millennia, Sorcerius had existed within the Eye of Terror, its impossible geometries and ever-shifting landscapes reflecting the whims of Tzeentch and the psychic emanations of its inhabitants. The planet's sudden materialization in the Prospero sector during the Wrath of Magnus campaign sent shockwaves through the Imperium's astropathic network, causing mass hysteria on nearby worlds as mortal minds struggled to comprehend a realm of pure sorcery intruding into material space. Magnus the Red orchestrated this unprecedented feat through a ritual of staggering complexity. For centuries, the Crimson King had gathered specific artifacts from across the galaxy, star charts from the Black Library, crystallized emotions from extinct Xeno species, and fragments of the original psychic wards that once protected Terra. These components, combined with the sacrifice of thousands of specially prepared vessels, created a momentary alignment between the immaterium and real space that allowed Sorcerius to slip through the dimensional barrier. The timing was meticulously calculated to coincide with Abaddon's 13th Black Crusade, though Magnus pursued objectives distinct from the War Masters. While Abaddon focused on destroying Cadia and its pylons, Magnus directed his legion against the Fenris system, home of his ancient enemies, the Space Wolves. This was no mere continuation of an old vendetta. The Crimson King's plans incorporated both revenge and strategic necessity in equal measure. The assault began with a series of feints across multiple sectors adjacent to Fenris. Small thrall bands struck at outposts and monitoring stations, overwhelming their defenders before disappearing back into the warp. These attacks followed no discernible pattern from an Imperial perspective, but formed a precise geometric arrangement when mapped across real space, a vast sorcerous circuit that channeled warp energy toward the Fenris system while diverting Imperial reinforcements away from Magnus' true objective. As the Space Wolves mobilized to counter these scattered threats, Magnus unveiled the next phase of his plan. 9 silver towers, massive demonic fortresses that served as both weapons platforms and sorceress amplifiers, materialized in strategic positions throughout the Fenris system. Each tower was commanded by a coven of exalted sorcerers who had spent centuries preparing for this moment, their minds and bodies reshaped to serve as living conduits for the immense energies they would channel. The silver towers targeted not military installations, but sites of mythic significance to the Space Wolves, places where the barrier between real space and the immaterium had been thinned by millennia of ritualistic activity disguised as primitive Fenrisian traditions. The Thousand Suns recognized what the Space Wolves themselves had forgotten or never known, that the shamanistic practices of Fenris had created a network of psychic nodes that, if properly manipulated, could transform the entire system into a warp real space interface similar to the planet of sorcerers itself. From his command tower, Magnus directed the assault with calculating precision. Rubric Marines teleported onto Fenris and its neighboring worlds in perfect geometric formations, establishing anchor points for larger sorceress workings. T-Zonger packs swept through outlying settlements, their bestial forms empowered by proximity to the silver towers. Disc-riding scarab occult terminators descended upon Space Wolf shrines and temples, their ancient armor now inscribed with glowing sigils that disrupted the runic wards maintained by the rune priests. The Space Wolves responded with characteristic fury, but found themselves fighting an enemy that attacked on multiple levels simultaneously. While Fenrisian warriors could engage the physical manifestations of the Thousand Suns forces, they lacked the means to counter the sorceress transformations affecting their worlds. Each Thousand Suns victory, no matter how minor, created another anchor point for Magnus' grand ritual, gradually reshaping the metaphysical topology of the system. Most alarming to the defenders was the effect on Fenris itself. The world's legendary weather patterns, always extreme, became increasingly unnatural. Blizzards formed complex spiral patterns visible from orbit. Lightning strikes carved Tzintkian symbols into mountainsides. The great oceans developed currents that flowed in impossible configurations, creating whirlpools that revealed glimpses of the warp beneath the surface. Most disturbing were reports from isolated settlements of children born with mutations, a phenomenon unprecedented in Fenrisian history despite the harsh radiation that had always affected the population. The conflict escalated when the Space Wolves, recognizing the existential threat to their homeworld, recalled their scattered great companies and requested assistance from successor chapters. The arrival of the Wolf brothers, Wolfspear, and other descendants of Leman Russ bolstered the defenders, but Magnus had anticipated this response. As the reinforcements translated from the warp, they found navigation near impossible due to the sorceress distortions spreading throughout the system. Many vessels arrived far from their intended destinations, while others became temporarily lost in pocket dimensions created by the Silver Towers. The battle for the Fenris system reached its climax when Magnus himself descended upon Fenris. The demon Primarch no longer resembled the scholarly figure who had once built the libraries of Prospero. His massive form radiated raw warp energy that caused reality to warp around him. Great wings of iridescent energy extended from his back, and his single eye contained swirling galaxies of possibility. Where he walked, the ground transmuted into crystalline structures that reflected not the physical surroundings, but the dreams and nightmares of those nearby. Magnus made directly for the Fang, the ancient fortress monastery of the Space Wolves. Unlike his previous assault millennia earlier, he did not attempt to breach its defenses through direct confrontation. Instead, he established a position on a nearby peak and began a complex incantation that caused the mountain beneath the Fang to resonate with sympathetic energies. The very bedrock of Fenris, infused with the psychic imprint of countless generations of Space Wolves, became a conduit for Magnus' sorcery. The Space Wolves, led by Great Wolf Logan Grimnar, launched a desperate counterattack to disrupt Magnus' ritual. Accompanied by his Wolf Guard and supported by all available rune priests, Grimnar fought through layers of Thousand Suns defenders to reach the demon Primarch. The confrontation between Grimnar and Magnus represented more than a physical battle. It was a clash between fundamentally opposed understandings of the warp. The Great Wolf's runic axe, empowered by Fenrisian tradition, met Magnus' staff of kaleidoscopic energy that channeled the raw power of Tzinch. Though Grimnar fought with unprecedented fury, even wounding the demon Primarch, he could not prevent the completion of the ritual. As the final words of power echoed across the mountainside, a psychic shockwave rippled through the Fenris system. The barrier between real space and the warp, already thinned by the actions of the Silver Towers, temporarily collapsed across multiple worlds. In that moment, Magnus extracted what he had come for, the metaphysical template of the Space Wolves' connection to their homeworld, a psychic architecture created by the Emperor himself when he first discovered Leman Russ. With his prize secured, Magnus withdrew his forces through precisely calculated warp rifts. The Silver Towers vanished one by one, leaving behind crystalline structures that continued to emit sorcerous radiation. The Rubric Marines and other Thousand Suns forces teleported away in carefully timed sequences that formed the final components of Magnus' grand working. As the last elements departed, the fabric of reality across the Fenris system began to stabilize, but not to its original configuration. The aftermath of the wrath of Magnus left the Fenris system fundamentally altered. While the Space Wolves maintained control of their homeworld and eventually cleansed the most obvious corruptions, subtle changes remained beyond their ability to detect or counter. The psychic resonance between Fenrisian wolves and the Space Wolf gene seed intensified, leading to increased Wolfen transformations. The weather patterns, always extreme, now occasionally formed configurations that briefly resembled Tzinchian symbols when viewed from orbit. Most concerning to the chapter's leadership were reports that the Canis Helix, the unique first component of Space Wolf gene seed, had developed new expressions that their apothecaries struggled to understand. For the Thousand Suns, the campaign represented their most significant victory since the heresy. The extraction of the Space Wolves' metaphysical template provided Magnus with crucial components for his greater working, the permanent translation of sorcerers into real space. Using the knowledge gained from the Fenris system, combined with similar templates extracted from other campaigns across the millennia, the Crimson King completed the grand ritual that anchored the planet of sorcerers in the material universe. The materialization of sorcerers coincided with the formation of the Great Rift, the galaxy-spanning warp storm triggered by the fall of Cadia, and the culmination of Abaddon's 13th Black Crusade. While Imperial scholars debate whether Magnus anticipated this cataclysm or merely exploited it opportunistically, the timing allowed the planet of sorcerers to establish itself in real space with minimal resistance. As Imperial forces struggled to comprehend the galaxy-wide disaster unfolding around them, the Thousand Suns secured their new domain in the Prospero sector, a bitter irony not lost on those familiar with the Legion's history. The physical manifestation of sorcerers in real space revealed a realm that defied conventional understanding. Unlike normal planets bound by physical laws, the planet of sorcerers existed simultaneously as a material world and as a warp construct. Its geography constantly shifted according to the psychic currents generated by its inhabitants. Mountains rose and fell like waves on an ocean. Structures built of impossible geometries dotted the landscape, their architecture shifting when not directly observed. Rivers of liquid that resembled molten metal but behaved like living tissue carved new courses through the terrain with each passing moment. At the center of this ever-changing landscape stood the impossible fortress, Magnus' personal domain, and the seat of what passed for governance among the Thousand Suns. The structure existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, with sections that could only be accessed through specific psychic frequencies. Its spires reached heights that varied depending on the observer's perspective, and its foundations extended into pocket dimensions that contained entire landscapes. Within this non-Euclidean complex, Magnus established chambers housing the artifacts and knowledge accumulated over 10 millennia of exile. The Great Rift's formation had profound implications for the Thousand Suns beyond providing cover for sorcerers' manifestation. The galaxy-spanning warp storm represented the most significant thinning of the barrier between real space and the immaterium since the birth of Slaanesh. For a legion whose power derived directly from warp manipulation, this new reality offered unprecedented opportunities. Sorcerous workings that would have required extensive preparation and enormous power became considerably easier to perform. Psychic communications could reach across vast distances with greater clarity. Most significantly, the summoning and maintenance of demonic entities in real space required substantially less energy, allowing for more permanent and stable manifestations. This enhanced connection to the warp accelerated the psychic awakening occurring across human populations throughout the galaxy. The Thousand Suns, with their millennia of experience in identifying and exploiting psychic potential, moved quickly to take advantage of this development. Specialized thrallbands deployed to worlds experiencing unusual concentrations of psychic manifestations, abducting promising individuals for use as vessels or sacrifices, while leaving behind cults dedicated to Tzinch that would continue to identify and collect psychically active humans. The Legion's activities following the establishment of sorcerers in real space demonstrated a new strategic focus. Rather than the targeted acquisition campaigns that had characterized their previous operations, the Thousand Suns began establishing permanent footholds across multiple sectors. These outposts, typically centered around sites of psychic significance, served as forward bases for further expansion and as anchors for a growing network of warp corridors connecting directly to the planet of sorcerers. This network allowed for unprecedented coordination between thrallbands operating across vast distances. Exalted sorcerers could communicate instantly with their counterparts on Sorcererius, sharing intelligence and requesting reinforcements without relying on unpredictable warp travel. Artifacts and captives could be transported directly to the planet of sorcerers for study or incorporation into ongoing rituals. Most significantly, the network enabled Magnus to project his influence across multiple sectors simultaneously, directing operations with a precision impossible before the Great Rift's formation. The return of Guilliman as Lord Commander of the Imperium and the launch of the Indomitus Crusade presented new challenges for the Thousand Suns. The Primarch's strategic genius and the introduction of Primaris Space Marines temporarily disrupted several of Magnus' longer-term operations. The Crimson King adjusted his strategies accordingly, focusing on regions beyond the immediate reach of Guilliman's crusade, while preparing specialized countermeasures against the enhanced capabilities of the Primaris Astartes. These countermeasures reflected the Thousand Suns' methodical approach to warfare. Through careful observation of early engagements between their forces and Primaris units, Legion sorcerers identified specific vulnerabilities in the new Space Marines' mental conditioning. The standardized hypno-indoctrination used in creating Primaris Astartes, while effective against conventional threats, had not been designed to resist the particular forms of psychic manipulation in which the Thousand Suns specialized. Exploiting this weakness, Thousand Suns sorcerers developed techniques to induce specific failure states in Primaris neural architecture, causing hallucinations or temporary paralysis at critical moments. As the Imperium stabilized following the initial shock of the Great Rift and the launch of the Indomitus Crusade, the Thousand Suns' strategic position remained stronger than at any point since the heresy. The establishment of Sorcererius in real space provided a secure base of operations immune to conventional imperial attack. The psychic awakening occurring across human populations offered an expanding resource pool of potential recruits and vessels. Most significantly, Magnus' extraction of metaphysical templates from multiple sources over the millennia had provided him with unprecedented insight into the Emperor's original workings, knowledge that informed his current ambitions. These ambitions extend beyond mere revenge against the Imperium or service to Tzeentch. Magnus seeks nothing less than the fundamental restructuring of human psychic potential across the galaxy. The rituals performed during the Wrath of Magnus campaign and similar operations elsewhere represent components of a vast working designed to alter how human consciousness interfaces with the warp. If successful, this grand ritual would remove the instabilities that make untrained psychers vulnerable to possession and madness, creating a new paradigm where psychic ability becomes a controlled and predictable aspect of human existence. This goal, ironically, mirrors Magnus' original ambition before the heresy, to guide humanity's psychic evolution toward a stable future. The methods he now employs, corrupted by 10 millennia of chaos influence and his own bitterness, bear little resemblance to the scholarly approach he once advocated. Yet in the Crimson King's fractured mind, there exists a twisted continuity between his current actions and his original purpose. He still sees himself as the architect of humanity's psychic future, even as he serves the very forces that the Emperor sought to protect mankind against. As the 42nd millennium advances and the galaxy adjusts to the new reality of the Great Rift, the Thousand Suns stand at the apex of their power since the Burning of Prospero. From their impossible citadels on Sorcerius, Magnus and his sorcerer lords direct operations across multiple sectors, gathering knowledge and power while advancing their inscrutable agendas. Their legion remains numerically small compared to other chaos forces, but their mastery of the warp makes them disproportionately influential in the great game. The Sons of Magnus continue their ancient pursuit of knowledge, though the purpose of that pursuit has transformed beyond recognition. What began as scholarly curiosity became desperate survival, then bitter vengeance, and finally twisted ambition. Yet through all these transformations, the Legion has maintained its fundamental character as masters of the arcane, seekers after secrets that reshape reality itself. In this constancy amid corruption lies perhaps the greatest tragedy of the Thousand Suns, that their greatest strengths became the instruments of their damnation, and that their noblest aspirations twisted into the very nightmare their Primarch once sought to prevent.